Benvenuti. It's really an honor and a pleasure to introduce the 6th Italian Conference on Analytic Metaphysics and Ontology. Thank you for being here, all of you. The conference was scheduled for 2020, but the well-known pandemic question changed our plans. We are glad, however, that it's now possible to spend some days together and in person talking about metaphysics. We all know that the most fecund intuitions, the most clever counter-objections, and the most beautiful moments are usually at coffee breaks, lunch, and social dinners. So this series of metaphysical conferences was founded several years ago by real pioneers of this topic in Italy. Some of them, Andrea Bottani and Alberto Voltolini, for instance, are or will be here. And this makes us feel heirs of a great tradition. The analytical philosophy in Italy is still a minorancy, but it has hugely grown in the last 30 years. Mainly, the scientific quality of the young scholars is outstanding. Metaphysics and ontology studies have benefited for this expansion. There are now several Italian scholars who publish their research in the top journals. And in the end, it is with a bit of pride that we announce the publication of the first Italian introduction to the analytical philosophy. Metaphysics. History of philosophy teaches us that the first philosophical questions of human beings were very probably metaphysical questions about the arche. Today it will be more trendy to say grounding, probably, of all things. But metaphysics is also a discipline that merges with the other branches of philosophical thought. In this regard, we organized a workshop on Jessica Wilson's book, The Metaphysics of Emergence, where the relationships among metaphysics, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind are crucial. Thanks, Jessica, for being here. We thank all of you that, as invited or contributed speakers, are taking part in this conference. The call for abstract was successful. We received more than 100 submissions, and sometimes the choice was really thorny. We tried to make some room to young scholars at early stages of their careers. The future of metaphysics is in your hands. All this would be not possible if we did not have access to funding by l'Aquila University, Padua University, Catholic University of Milan, Pol Post Project granted by Cari Paro Foundation, Ontoformat Research Group, and last but not least by Italian Society for Analytical Philosophy. SIFA has supported from the very beginning the adventure of analytical metaphysics in Italy, and here has founded the SIFA lecture. Special thanks to the Department of Philosophy of l'Aquila University that hosts us. The local organizing committee made an incredible job. To Donatella Donati, Simone Gozzano, Giorgio Lando, Cristina Nenca, a special thanks. We hope you are going to spend a lovely time in l'Aquila talking about fascinating and complex topics, investigating the intimate nature of things, looking for the deep structure of reality. In a word, doing metaphysics is a great privilege, and it is a very beautiful thing. Thanks to be here sharing all that. Buon lavoro.
Thanks, Ciro, and welcome everyone. I'm one of the local committee, Simone, my name, and I'm going to give you some practical information. The first practical information is don't ask me about practical information. I usually get lost. So I can report practical information, but I wish to again, to say that most of the founding of the conference was from the so-called Department of Excellence, which was a sort of national competition that has been held in Italy 5 years ago among all the departments in Italy, and our department was recognized for this extra funding that we are wasting the money in philosophical conferences. So let's go to the practical infos. And the first and most important practical infos is be careful with your badge, because this entitles you to have a coffee break. And for having the coffee break will be in the bar, which is just opposite of the main entrance. So the food is there, and the entitled for the food is here. Program, there are many changes or some changes, so check the website, or perhaps we're going to write something on the board here in the front of this room. Web, there is the EduRoam web, so log in that one. If you wish to have some sort of a tourist tour of l'Aquila, the info point next to the so-called Fontana Luminosa, the enlightened fountain, which is here, there is a booth, I would say, that says info point, and there is also people that may give you a tour in English of the city. And I think, did I forget something last? No. So it's my great pleasure to invite Jessica Wilson on stage, to say, more as a show, for the first plenary talk of this conference. Jessica, the talk is... You want to say that?
I can do that.
Whatever,
We
are on the web as well.
It's more relaxing.
Yeah. The title is Quantum and Buddhist Indeterminacy. We're going to have a little amount of time for the Q&A, and perhaps we may add some other Q&A space up in the workshop that will be tomorrow, if I'm right with the practical infos. Okay. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Simone. Thank you so much to the organizers. It's my honor and privilege to kick off the 6th Italian conference in Analytic Metaphysics and Ontology. It's just fantastic to be here, and welcome. And I hope you enjoy this talk, which is not on emergence. Didn't want to make people too sick of Wilson on emergence. So instead I'll be talking about a topic that my co-author and I, Claudio Colosi, have explored, namely metaphysical indeterminacy. And we have written, I guess now, 3 papers on quantum indeterminacy, and in particular arguing that my and our preferred approach to metaphysical indeterminacy does better by way of accommodating certain quantum phenomena than the competing, prior approach to metaphysical indeterminacy, which is a form of metaphysical supervaluationism. So I'm going to say what that is down the line. But in this talk, I'm exploring the possibility that there's a very different, apparently different source of metaphysical indeterminacy that arises out of a certain school of Buddhist thought, namely the Chinese tradition, Huayan Buddhism, and other sorts of schools of Buddhist thought, which involves a kind of interpretation of the notion of emptiness that first was formulated or characterized by the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna. And I want to argue that there are various interesting parallels between the kind of the status of indeterminacy in the quantum tradition, the status of indeterminacy in this Chinese Buddhist tradition, as well as the source of indeterminacy in the 2 cases, and also their proper treatment. So I'm going to have to kind of give you a whirlwind tour of these 2 different approaches, or these 2 different sources or contexts within which metaphysical indeterminacy arguably arises. So here goes. So let's start with the status of Buddhist, of quantum and Buddhist indeterminacy as properly metaphysical. So indeterminacy in any kind of context, admits of various interpretations, typically as potentially representational or semantic, perhaps epistemic, or metaphysical. So the first thing I want to do is argue that in certain, on certain readings of the indeterminacy that arises in quantum context, as well as certain interpretations of emptiness in the Buddhist context, the indeterminacy at issue is in fact properly metaphysical. And I'm not going to be able to provide any kind of detailed arguments for these claims, so I'm basically going to be gesturing at certain kinds of considerations and, more or less assertions in some cases to the effect that the indeterminacy should be treated as properly metaphysical. So starting with the quantum context, so what's really interesting about quantum mechanics and why it sort of blows our mind, and involves such a crazy departure from classical understanding of natural reality in particular, is this notion of value indefiniteness. And this, as I say here, lies at the heart of what is supposed to be distinctive about quantum phenomena. And then there are a bunch of interesting sort of case studies which are supposed, you're probably all familiar with some or most of these or all of these with respect to kind of cases in point of the value indeterminacy that arises in quantum mechanics. So for example, there's the case of the double slit experiment. So in this case, the idea is you have a particle that's shot through a kind of barrier, and whether one slit is open or two slits are open makes a kind of non-classical difference to the interference pattern that appears, or the pattern that appears on the screen. Multiple electrons or particles are being shot through. So in this case, prior to detection, the idea is the location of a particle in that experiment, in the double slit experiment, is indeterminate. So there's no it's not clear whether in any given case you can't say that it definitively went through one or the other. And it seems in certain, as I'll kind of suggest down the line, it seems in certain respects to have gone through both. But then how can that be? How can a single particle go through two slits at the same time? Another case in point is Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger had this thought experiment, kind of gruesome. You put a cat in a box with some kind of device which would involve atomic decay that's quantumly determined. And prior to opening the box, the idea is that the cat is neither determinately alive nor determinately dead, in the case that a decay would release some poison or something like that. Another case in point is that a particle cannot, now this is really pervasive kind of value indeterminacy, a particle cannot have precise values of both position and momentum at the same time. And there's other sorts of properties of quantum entities and so on, which are, again, such that you cannot have precise values of for example, energy and time, location and time at the same time. Another case in point is that the components of a spin-entangled state do not have determinate values of spin. And so on these cases and on various interpretations of quantum mechanics, the indeterminacy that these various case studies suggest is properly metaphysical, not merely epistemic or semantic. So I have some quotations from Wolff and Darby, who are kind of registering that claim for the case of the orthodox interpretation. And then Claudio Colosi and I have argued that there's also lingering metaphysical indeterminacy, not just on the orthodox interpretation, but also on the GRW interpretation, reflecting a kind of tail problem that's associated with that interpretation, as well as the Everettian many worlds interpretation, which reflects remaining indeterminacy in world branches. So again, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go into a huge amount of detail about that. We do have, these papers if you're interested in seeing how we argue there. So let's suppose then that these various, at least it's a live possibility, let's say, that the indeterminacy in these quantum contexts can be given a metaphysical interpretation. Now let's turn to this Buddhist school of thought. Again, on certain schools of Buddhist thought, notably the Chinese Madhyamaka school, there is indeterminacy that's associated with an interpretation of Nagarjuna's doctrine that all things are empty as the doctrine that all things are lacking determinate nature. So Chensing Ho has a really nice paper on this topic where I'm going to have several extended quotations. I won't read through them in the interest of time. I'll pick out a few claims that he makes here. But what he argues is that you can understand Chinese Madhyamaka as involving metaphysical indeterminacy and moreover, a kind of metaphysical indeterminacy that just to cut to the chase, involves an application of my preferred approach to metaphysical indeterminacy. But by way of kind of seeing the interesting trajectory in the Buddhist tradition, you kind of start with Nagarjuna's notion of emptiness as motivated by the idea that all things, as he says here, arise, abide, and perish, depending on various causal and non-causal factors. So Nagarjuna contended that things have no independent and invariable nature or existence, that is to say, no intrinsic nature. So the idea of emptiness in the Indian Buddhist tradition in particular is often sort of characterized or given a spin as being the claim that, things have no intrinsic nature. But then when the Indian Buddhist tradition moved over to China, there was a kind of, a different overall understanding of what this notion of emptiness entailed, quite different actually. It becomes much more holistic, among other things, but a different aspect of the kind of transition from the Indian conception of emptiness in the Buddhist tradition to the Chinese conception is associated with a translation of the Sanskrit term for intrinsic nature, occasionally being translated as determinate nature. So the claim that nothing has intrinsic nature then sort of morphed into the claim that nothing has determinate nature, which I think is actually a very interesting and related but somewhat different conception of the notion of emptiness. So this has led the Chinese Madhyamakas to think that for things to be empty is for them to be devoid of determinate form or nature and nature. Okay. So once again, the indeterminacy here is understood as properly metaphysical, not just epistemic or representational. So Ho says that the Chinese Madhyamakas locate the lack of determinate nature and form in what we commonsensically take to be things. They would not think of the world, for example, as a determinate array of determinate things or facts. Rather, the idea is that things themselves are indeterminate. The indeterminacy is worldly. And Ho characterizes this in what he calls Madhyamaka-based ontological indeterminacy, MOI. So for a thing to be X to be ontically indeterminate at time t with respect to the way it is for X to be such that no concept or expression can be conclusively applied to X at that time, in the sense, and this is the important part, in the sense of representing definitively the way that it is. And he gives a kind of, illustrative case of a daffodil. If the word daffodil were to represent definitively the way that something X is, then X would be finally, non-relatively, and exclusively a daffodil, not any other kind of plant or object. Yet, on the kind of ontological or ontic indeterminacy that's associated with the Chinese Madhyamaka tradition, nothing can be so determinately represented. You can provisionally determine something as being such and such a way, but no such determination excludes other determinations, and no such determination is definitive. So X is not definitively or conclusively determinable. Okay? It is not capable of being determined as definitively such and such a way. Now, one thing to clarify is that in talking about using concepts or notions or terms to describe something, you might think that there might, the indeterminacy being described here or characterized here is in some sense merely semantic. But Ho clarifies that that's not the case. Now, in the both the Indian and the Chinese Buddhist traditions, they will often talk about human conceptualization and how it enters into, these provisional determinations. But even had no humans or conscious creatures been around, the considerations that are really more deeply motivating the idea that things don't have intrinsic nature or determinate nature would still be in place. So Ho just goes ahead and talks about that as well. There is semantic indeterminacy that's associated with this Buddhist tradition, but it's generated by the worldly indeterminacy. It's not itself the fundamental form of indeterminacy in this tradition. So the indeterminacy also in the Chinese Madhyamaka tradition is irreducibly metaphysical, notwithstanding that the characterizations of emptiness often will advert to conceptualization. And more generally, that this metaphysical indeterminacy will generate semantic indeterminacy, but that's down the line. The metaphysical indeterminacy is prior. So quantum indeterminacy and Chinese Madhyamaka indeterminacy, both plausibly seen as metaphysical, not merely epistemic, not merely representational. Now I want to suggest that there's also, interestingly enough, a common structural source that's kind of generating the metaphysical indeterminacy in these two cases. So Claudio and I have, in our work on quantum indeterminacy, we've identified what seem to be different sources of quantum metaphysical indeterminacy, superposition, involving the failure of a system, for example, to have any determinate value of a single observable. So this is what's going on in the Schrodinger's cat case or the double slit experiment. So in the Schrodinger's cat case, the observable at issue is, life status, so to speak. And in the double slit experiment, the observable at issue would be, the trajectory through one but not the other slit. There's also other seemingly different sources of quantum metaphysical indeterminacy associated with incompatible observables and entanglement. What here I want to do is just focus on the case of superposition-based quantum indeterminacy as, itself quite similar, I'm going to argue, to the kind of indeterminacy that's going on in the Chinese tradition. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the Schrodinger's cat case in the state that's at issue here on the handout, and a single electron in the double slit experiment in the state here on the handout. So to start, I just want to point out that it's very natural to see cases of superposition in these paradigm cases as ones in which both the determinate values of the observable are in some sense instantiated. I mean, one consideration here would be that the formalism itself, if you look at these the representations of the superposition states, they involve these plus signs. They look like additive combinations of the determinate properties or states that at issue. So the formalism sort of suggests that superpositions involve additive combinations of determinate properties or states. And I think it's also really interesting and significant that both Einstein and Dirac offer characterizations of these experiments in terms that suggest that they are on board with what the formalism suggests. So, for example, Einstein described Schrodinger's case in these kind of, as I put it, glutty terms where somehow or another, you have a system or an object, and somehow or another, both of these determinate states are being instantiated, even though, and this is part of the puzzle, in classical contexts, those states are incompatible. So the puzzle is how to make sense of how could Schrodinger's cat be somehow both alive and dead at the same time when we think of those as incompatible states for any object to be in. But nonetheless, Einstein does describe the Schrodinger's cat case in those terms. At a fixed time, parts of, there should be an omega function, correspond to the cat being alive, and other parts to the cat being pulverized. Psi function, sorry. So also in the case of the double slit experiment, Dirac says, so long as the photon is partly in one beam and partly in the other, interference can occur when the two beams are superposed. So, Dirac too, thinking in these, as I put it, these glutty terms, where somehow or another the, superposition-based indeterminacy is somehow involving these two determinate states being co-instantiated. So if we can understand that as being possible, that would, by the way, offer an explanation of the interference patterns in the double slit experiment, and this is something that Claudio and I have recently argued. But Dirac himself suggested this, that the interference, the puzzling non-classical interference that occurs in the double slit experiment can involve the idea that the particle is in some sense interfering with itself. So supposing that we can understand superposition in these terms, then the failure of the system to have a determinate value of the observable could be seen as reflecting that the instantiation of a determinate value of the observable somehow does not rule out the instantiation of a seemingly incompatible determinate value of that same observable. So that's the quantum case. So that's the source of the indeterminacy we're suggesting. And Claudio and I have suggested previously, and I'm suggesting here, plausibly involves a kind of glutty indeterminacy where, multiple determinants are somehow being instantiated. Now, interestingly, MOI involves a very similar phenomenon. So recall that, as above, on that Buddhist view, any given object, quote, is not capable of being determined as definitively such and such, or as definitively possessing this or that feature. And this is because any such determination is never to the exclusion of other determinations, and no determination is definitive. Thus, any given object is not definitively or conclusively determinable as such and such specific way. And Ho goes on and he offers this various remarks in support of this characterization. So this is basically expanding on the daffodil case. Okay. So what I want to suggest is that here too, the metaphysical indeterminacy reflects the supposition that an object can in some sense be the subject of incompatible property instantiation. So as he was saying, what a villager takes to be a daffodil may be food for slugs and snails, a stick ablaze for some meditating yogis, or a mass of wave particles of indeterminate nature for a quantum physicist. So these are different, seemingly incompatible ways for something to be, but on Chinese Madhyamaka, you can't, any of these given objects, there is going to be a range of different determinations of that object in these seemingly incompatible ways. So I suggest the source of the metaphysical indeterminacy in the Chinese Buddhist tradition bears a very close resemblance to the source at issue in superposition-based metaphysical indeterminacy in quantum context. So it seems natural, for example, to apply Ho's description to the case of Schrodinger's cat. Prior to opening the box, one might provisionally determine the cat as being alive, since after all, it's not true that the cat is not alive, right? But any such determination is, quote, never to the exclusion of other determinations, and no determination is definitive. So that one might also provisionally determine the cat as dead, since after all, it's not true that the cat is not dead, right? Now, this source of indeterminacy, metaphysical indeterminacy in these two contexts, I think we can say a little bit more that concerns the depth of the metaphysical indeterminacy that's at issue. In other words, can you get rid of the metaphysical indeterminacy? In both of these contexts, there's a commonality in the sense that the metaphysical indeterminacy is in certain respects insuperable, or as Brad Scow put it, deep. So, for example, in the Chinese case, though Ho characterizes MOI as expressing what it would be for a given X to be metaphysically indeterminate, so he's talking just about what would be for a given object to be metaphysically indeterminate. The characterization this characterization will enter into the general Chinese Majamika position, which Ho calls the theory of ontological indeterminacy, TOI, according to which everything is insuperably indeterminate. So it's not just the case that there happen to be some objects or systems that are subject to this kind of indeterminacy in the Chinese Buddhist tradition. Rather, the idea is that everything is subject to this same form of indeterminacy. Now, in the quantum case, you might think that superposition quantum indeterminacy might not be insuperable, since, after all, couldn't you, for example, collapse the state upon suitable measurement? So when I open up the box and I determine whether or not the cat is alive or dead, so I got rid of that superposition-based indeterminacy. But there are a couple of lines of thought which suggest that ultimately that is not going to be a definitive kind of determination, to use Ho's expression. So, for example, Artzenius observes that it is well known that developments of quantum mechanical states, according to the Schrödinger equation, during a measurement seem to prevent measurements from having definite results. For the usually assumed Schrödinger development of the measured object and the measuring apparatus during a measurement typically results in a state of the entire system, which is the superposition of the eigenstates of the measured observable and measuring observable. So the superposition, so to speak, grows with the measurement. It just locates the indeterminacy in a broader system. Moreover, and this is perhaps yet more important, as cases of indeterminacy that are associated with certain other quantum phenomena, such as orthogonal spin values, indicates a future measurement, resulting, for example, in spin x up, in the case of entangled particles, can render indeterminate a previously determinate value outcome of a previous measurement in, e.g., the spin y direction. So in this sense, determinate outcomes are irreducibly provisional, just as on MOI. And finally, there's yet another consideration. More generally, at the level of the world as a whole, quantum metaphysical indeterminacy is, as Scow put it, deep. That is to say, at the level of the world, there's not going to be any case where you will be able to give determinate values to every observable at a time. And there's various theorems to that effect, but just thinking about irreducible, incompatible, observable metaphysical indeterminacy involving, for example, position and momentum, that will kind of give you that indication. So the metaphysical indeterminacy in both cases is, in some sense, insuperable. So that's, I think, another source of deep parallelism between these deep forms of indeterminacy. So now, I want to turn to the question of how we should accommodate quantum and Buddhist indeterminacy and argue that they admit of a similar or the same sorts of treatment. So supposing we want to accommodate the indeterminacy in quantum contexts or Buddhist contexts in properly metaphysical terms, what are our options? And here I'll say a little bit more about the two positions I mentioned earlier on. One approach, I'll call it a metaphysical supervaluationist approach, or sometimes just a supervaluationist approach. On this kind of approach, I have characterized this as a meta-level approach because the metaphysical indeterminacy is understood to involve its being kind of primitively indeterminate which determinate state of affairs obtains. So the indeterminacy is at the meta level in the sense that first order states of affairs are assumed to be maximally determinate, maximally precise. And metaphysical indeterminacy concerns, in the way that it's sometimes put, the world itself being unsettled about which precise way it is. But the supposition is that it is, in fact, one precise way. Exactly how to make sense of that, that combination of the world's being unsettled and yet it is, in fact, one precise way. It's unsettled about which precise way it is. I leave that for people to explore themselves, but that's the basic idea. When some state of affairs is metaphysically indeterminate, there's various precise options, and it's just unsettled which in fact obtains. Now, on a contrasting approach, this is the one I have proposed and Claudio and I have developed as applying to quantum contexts. This is what I call a determinable-based account, or more generally, it's an object-level approach, according to which metaphysical indeterminacy involves its being determinate or just plain true that an indeterminate state of affairs exists. So the indeterminacy on this approach is just located right in the world itself, in the states of affairs, in ways that then I try to develop in a way appealing to the determinable-determinate relation, which is, in the first instance, something that you're familiar with colors, say, red being a determinable of determinate shades such as scarlet, crimson, burgundy, and so on. So I suggest that what it is for a state of affairs to be metaphysically indeterminate in a given respect at a time is for that state of affairs to constitutively involve an object or system, entity, etc., such that that object has a determinable property at that time, but for some level of determination of that determinable property, the object does not have a unique determinant of that property, of that determinable property. And the failure of unique determination can involve either there being too many candidate determinants on the scene for us to pick out one of them as being the unique determinant that the object has, or it could involve, and this is an interesting case as well, just no determinate values are instantiated. So to prefigure, I'm going to suggest that in the case of superposition-based metaphysical indeterminacy, as well as in the case of Chinese Majamika indeterminacy, it's a glutty implementation of a determinable-based account that's at issue, where there are too many determinants to sort of pick out a unique one as the one and only determinant that the object has. Okay. I have a couple of other qualifications, points of difference between these two approaches. One thing I think is quite interesting is that on a supervaluationist approach, metaphysical indeterminacy is going to generate propositional indeterminacy. But on a determinable-based approach, metaphysical indeterminacy does not generate any propositional indeterminacy, and as a consequence, supervaluationist approaches have to, they understand truth as super truth. They can get back, the theorems of classical logic, but they have difficulties accommodating certain inference rules. They also have to introduce some kind of indeterminacy operator to accommodate this propositional indeterminacy, whereas on a determinable-based approach, there's no propositional indeterminacy. There's every claim is true or false and determinately, so there is no determinacy operator needed to implement determinable-based indeterminacy. So it'll just be a fact that this system has this determinable property, and it does not have any unique, for any specific determinant of that determinable. In a case of metaphysical indeterminacy, it will just be false that the object has it simpliciter. It might be true that it has it relative to some other perspective, but in any case, every proposition is either true or false, and so all the theorems of classical logic and so on go through without any problem. Okay. So now turning to quantum mechanics, first of all, several people, Scow, Darby, and Claudio, myself, and a few other people as well, have argued that to accommodate quantum metaphysical indeterminacy, supervaluationist approaches just simply won't work. In part, this is pretty straightforward to see why it won't work. It has to do with the insuperable worldly indeterminacy in the first instance that's associated with quantum mechanics. So if the metaphysical indeterminacy is in fact deep, such that it's impossible to give precise values to position and momentum, et cetera, for the systems that are at issue, at the level of the world, you're just not going to have worlds that are compatible with the quantum laws that are perfectly precise in all respects. Yet, a supervaluationist approach assumes that the world is in fact perfectly precise in all respects. The strategy is to render indeterminacy at the meta level on that approach. It's indeterminacy in which perfectly precise world is instantiated, or what perfectly precise states of affairs obtain. So the background presupposition of that approach is that you can resolve all the metaphysical indeterminacy at the level of the first order states of affairs or the world, okay? But that's incompatible with various theorems of quantum mechanics. More generally, various commitments of quantum mechanics. Whereas a determinable-based approach, an object-level approach of the sort that I and Claudio endorse, is perfectly compatible with there being that kind of insuperable metaphysical indeterminacy at the order of the first order states of affairs. Okay, so quantum indeterminacy, so we've argued, and several other people have argued, well, at least compatibly with us, that metaphysical supervaluationist approach to metaphysical indeterminacy will not work to accommodate quantum metaphysical indeterminacy, and then we have argued that a determinable-based approach will do so. Now, interestingly, as regards Chinese Majamaka indeterminacy, Ho has similarly argued that a supervaluationist account or approach will not work to accommodate the indeterminacy at issue, the metaphysical indeterminacy at issue, whereas a determinable-based approach or an object-level approach, of which a determinable-based approach is kind of a persistification, will do the job. So he says the supervaluationist account does not square well with MOI. You can read that if you want. All right. So let me see, I'm going to try and finish up a little bit more quickly. Now, let me just say a little bit as quickly as I can about the preferred implementation of a determinable-based account in the quantum context and Ho's endorsement of a similar kind of application of a determinable-based account to the Buddhist context. And this is a version of or an implementation of a determinable-based account that is not just a Gleddian interpretation, according to which the failure of unique determination of the determinable at issue involves there being too many candidate determinants on the scene. So that's a Gleddy implementation. You can read Claudio and my papers to see that there's actually more than one way to implement a Gleddy implementation of a determinable-based account. There's what we call multiple realized determination, and then there's also a degree theoretic approach. So here I'm going to focus on multiple relativized determination. Okay. By way of illustration of what is going on in such a case, we can think of an iridescent feather. This is my kind of paradigm case to illustrate how that would operate. Consider an iridescent feather. It is such as to have the property of being colored. It is colored simpliciter, but which determinant of that color it has or is properly attributed to it will depend on the perspective of viewing, or if you want to think of it in terms of objective circumstances, this spatial race and so on. So at best, with respect to this feather, you cannot say that it is, it's blue simpliciter. You cannot say that it's red simpliciter. You can say that it is blue relative to this perspective and it's red relative to that perspective, but you cannot, it does not have a unique determinant of the determinable color, okay? So that's a kind of blueprint for how there could be a glutty implementation of this determinable-based approach. So what we want to say is that, for example, in the double slit experiment, the electron concurrently travels through both slits, not simpliciter, because that would invoke a contradiction, but in relativized fashion. And this is going to generate the interference effects on the screen. And the question of exactly what the relativization is too is that admits of different interpretations. Okay, so now if we turn back to, and also with respect to Schrodinger's cat, it can't be that Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive simpliciter. It would have to be relativized to, different sorts of quantum perspectives. Okay, but it can be, you can make sense of the determinants both being had by the object in relativized fashion. That's basically the trick. Okay, so now turning back to the Chinese Majamaka context, Ho will take MOI to be properly accommodated via this glutty implementation involving multiple relativized determination. So he says, as ontically indeterminate, X is subject to multiple relativized determinations. We can determine X as such and such, where the determinations are relativized to different conceptual perspectives and are far from conclusive. They could be objective as well. These determinations are provisional in the sense that they are not definitive and do not predicate of X any determinate feature in such a way as to make it conclusively determinable. So, multiple relativized determination of the sort that I've proposed and we have developed Claudio and I have developed in the quantum context. This nicely models that on Chinese Majamaka indeterminacy, everything is both conclusively indeterminable. It cannot be given a determinate value simpliciter, but is provisionally, as Ho put it, provisionally determinable. It can be given a determinate value relative to some conceptual perspective or some objective circumstances, which are going to just depend on the different, the cases at issue. So I want to close by pointing to two potential points of difference between the Chinese and the Buddhist metaphysical indeterminacy that I've been discussing. In the quantum case, the indeterminacy is naturally understood in terms of determinables and determinants. So physicists are comfortable thinking about observables as determinables, and they talk in that way very, very commonly. But Ho is a little bit less sanguine about embracing determinables as the correct model for the kind of provisional determination that's going on there. He notes that the determination in the Chinese context need not specifically advert to determinables and determinants per se. And here I'll just mention that Dana Goswick has also noted that one could implement a variation on my determinable-based approach to metaphysical indeterminacy that is somewhat more general, that does not necessarily appeal specifically to determinable and determinate states, but something that's relevantly similar. And the other interesting potential difference is that Chinese Majamaka, the metaphysical indeterminacy at issue, it goes all the way down, but it also goes all the way up, in a sense. So Ho notes that there's a commitment to higher order indeterminacy in the Chinese Majamaka tradition as well. So it would be in some sense, metaphysically indeterminate, that it's metaphysically indeterminate, that ... Now, when I heuristically characterized my view as saying it's like, determinate or just plain true that an indeterminate phenomenon exists, that's just by way of kind of a first pass approach. A determinable-based approach can accommodate higher order indeterminacies, so that's fine. So I'm happy to take that on board. But with respect to the question of whether there's higher order indeterminacy, metaphysical indeterminacy in the quantum context, well, I think that's an interesting question. I'm not going to come down on that here, but if there is an absence of higher order metaphysical indeterminacy in some quantum context, that at least would be a difference from the pervasive higher order indeterminacy that Ho sees as characteristic of Chinese Madhyamaka metaphysical indeterminacy. So those are a couple of potential differences, but just to say, to close up, I would say that there's remarkable similarities as well, and one of the reasons I find this topic kind of interesting and wanted to explore it more is because in a context where metaphysical indeterminacy is at issue, quantum indeterminacy has offered kind of the best case scenario. And people say, well, if there is metaphysical indeterminacy, you've got this main case, namely quantum mechanics. Now, I do think that there is metaphysical indeterminacy in quantum mechanics, and you can make a case for that, but I think it's also fantastic for purposes of motivating the interest in metaphysical indeterminacy proper, that there's really a completely independent field or context within which metaphysical indeterminacy also seems to be core and crucial to the doctrine, and to see that these are actually very parallel in terms of their status as metaphysical, their source in a kind of glutty determination of where somehow incompatible properties or states can somehow be possessed by the same object, and to see that they could admit of similar treatment. I think that is really fascinating, and I hope you did too. Thanks. That's kind of it.
Thank you, Jessica, for this very interesting and challenging talk. Because, I don't know what the teaching of the Buddha now are, because I don't know what his teaching are not. Perhaps they are both there. Question 1, 2, and 3. No more, I think. Yes, here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk.
Thanks.
It's more of a clarification question. So, for you, a state of affair in this realm, it's kind of temporary, imprecise, perspectival. So if we take, very ancient, like archaic kind of an example, go back to the classics, you can step in the same river twice. It won't be a river anymore. And by the way, according to who is a river, to which perspective? Mm-hmm. So it's perspectival. Is it sort of, my knowledge of quantum mechanics is very lame. So perhaps it's very lame to quote Rovelli, which is a great writer, by the way, who has a very similar view on the point. His relativism in his understanding is the relativism of the great fathers of physics, is a development of the relativism of Galileo Galilei, of Einstein, and so everything is because there is a shifting, and also time is a strange shifting in perspective.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's over.
Good. Thank you. Actually, I wrote this paper for a conference at Berkeley that was on Buddhism, physics, and philosophy, and Carlo Rovelli was one of the speakers there, and he gave a really interesting talk as well. And he connected his work to Nagarjuna's work. So some of you may be familiar with Rovelli's work, but he's associated with a kind of relationist interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is also, I would say, closely connected with Nagarjuna's conception, according to which nothing has any intrinsic nature. Yes, very good. So one thing I will say about Carlo's interpretation, it occurred to me that his motivations for going relationist they could be challenged. Okay, I'm just going to throw that out there, because what he says is, strictly speaking, compatible with things having intrinsic dispositions that would manifest them. Anyway, that's just a throwaway comment if you're familiar with what he's working on. But yeah, so I like the idea of looking at relationist interpretations of quantum mechanics and connecting them to this project. So I guess I will just say that. And I think that's a good connection.
Could you say that this approach is more epistemological in a way? This is what you're suggesting?
No, I'm not. Yeah. So I think the question has to do with whether Carlo's relationism or related versions of relationist interpretation of quantum mechanics are such as to admit of something like intrinsic dispositions or not. Okay? If they do, then
you don't have a
then it would be different, at least from the kind of metaphysical indeterminacy or indeterminacy that is generated in the Buddhist tradition. Right? Good.
Please avoid determinable questions. Just determinate questions.
Hi, so I wanted to ask a question about the Glutty implementation of the view in the quantum case.
Yeah.
I sort of understand it in the feather case where you relativize the colors to like a perspective of viewing, but I wanted to hear more about what you relativize in the quantum case. So take a maximally simple case. There's only one particle in the whole universe, and it's a superposition of being located here or there. We don't want to say it's just there, period. We don't want to say it's over here, period. We want to say it's here relative to, and if there are no perspectives or agents around, what do we relativize it to?
Well, the notion of, first of all, let me just clarify that the notion of perspective doesn't have to involve agents or anything. It's supposed to be just circumstantial, so it could be objective in both the quantum and the Majamica case. What exactly you want to relativize to in the quantum case is something that we have more or less left open. We've made some suggestions about what we don't want it to be. We don't want it to be relative to measurements, for example, because in that would prevent, for example, in the double slit case, that would not provide a basis for the self-interference that we want to use our account to illuminate. In that case, in the double slit case, we suggested that maybe it was, we could look at something like the space of possible trajectories. So a little bit a la Feynman's sorts of approach, but again, we haven't come down on anything specific. We're just, but that was kind of as close as we got as far as the double slit case. But it might well be modal, and if it were modal, then that might accommodate the very simple case that you're discussing. But that's a nice case. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm afraid I have to cut the third question. I'm so sorry because we are on a tight schedule, so sorry about that. So, is that right? Yeah, because now we have to split in two groups.
Okay.
And the one group stays here, the other one goes one floor up, zero up. Okay. And thanks again, Jessica.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay.
So, let us begin with the first parallel, one of the first parallel sessions of this conference. And we begin with Giacomo Giannini, who is going to talk us about dated truths without dated manifestations.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And first of all, thanks to all the organizers for doing this. This looks like a fantastic conference, and I'm very happy to be here. It's the first conference in person that I have in a while, so I'm very excited about this. Okay, let's get to the chase. So my talk is about a class of, I think, somewhat neglected modal propositions that are modal propositions that involve a precise date and time, something like it could rain at exactly 5, or temperature will rise in 2025, or something like that. So here's the plan. I'll first tell you why I care about this subclass of modal propositions, and why I think that they raise some troubles with a couple of accounts of modality which I like. And then I'll run you through a couple of solutions. I'm not very satisfied with either of them, so hopefully you'll help me out in sort of finding a better account. I'll offer some reason why I prefer one to the other, but neither of them are completely, I don't have knockdowns arguments against one, and I don't have an amazing account of the other. So let's see, hopefully we can work it together. Okay, so dated truths are claims that involve a precise time, and I think we care about them a lot, both in mundane lives and matters and in scientific contexts. As I discovered yesterday, I clearly care about whether I can catch the plane from London to l'Aquila, but I also really care about whether I catch the 6:45 plane as opposed to the 3 o'clock plane, which I had to take in the end. And it's very simple to see how traditional possible world theories can deal with them, because after all, they're a collection of facts, and so you just need to have sort of temporally fine-grained facts in your possible worlds. That's easy. But I'm not so sure that essentialism and dispositionalism, so-called new actualist theory of modality, have such an easy time with them. So I take that as my sort of guiding desideratum, that if any theory of modality is any good, it should make sense of this. This is just a sort of corollary of the fact that a theory of modality has to be extensively inadequate, so nothing too spicy here. So as I said, I think that this class of truths raises problems also with essentialism, but I don't have time, and so I'll only talk about the theory of modality which I like. Dispositionalism, so very quickly, dispositionalism is the view that all modal truths, sort of absolute alethic modality we're talking about here, can be grounded in actual powers and all potentialities. And by this, I just mean irreducibly dispositional properties. Typical examples are stuff like fragility, flammability, solvability, and that sort of things, which cannot be analyzed in terms of sort of counterfactuals and whatnot. Powers are interesting and are modal properties in two senses. One is that they have a sort of rigid, robust modal profile, in that the idea that if something is fragile, it's something which is directed at some particular manifestation, in the case of fragility breaking, which can be a property event, etc. I'll talk as if it was a property in this talk, but all the same, really. And fragility has to be directed towards that particular manifestation in all possible worlds, according to the dispositionalist. And the second thing is that it hopefully can ground metaphysical modality, in that the guiding idea is it is possible that this vase breaks because the vase is fragile. A little bit more in detail, the idea is that possibly P is true if and only if and because there is some power whose manifestation is a truth maker for P. Something like that. Obviously, necessity is just a dual, so I won't waste time on it. This is obviously, we need to add all sorts of bell and whistle to make the account of modality work, but I'll stay on with the original here just to keep things simple. Okay. So here's the problem. How do we make sense of data claims, data truths, something like possibly the vase can break at 5? Here's the first strategy, which I think it's the most straightforward one, and at times I'm very attracted by it, but ultimately I think it has some problems. So I'm curious to see what you think about it. The idea is to say, well, look, data claims are just sort of more temporary fine-grained propositions or sentences. And given that the truth makers for model claims are just powers, you just need more fine-grained powers. That's all there is. And how do we make more fine-grained powers temporally? Well, we just have more fine-grained manifestations. So we just need to pack that extra temporal information within our manifestation. In our case, the reason why we want to pack the information in the manifestation is very simple. That is a certain power P is the truth maker of a claim, possibly Q. Again, if its manifestation is the truth maker of the non-model claim, and if our non-model claim is something very precise, we will need a very precise manifestation. And so the idea is to say that, well, look, I want to make true that possibly the sugar dissolves at 3 past midday, and all I need is a potentiality that is directed to this particular event or property, namely dissolving at 3 past midday. Everything is very straightforward with this account, so why don't I like it? What's the deal with it? I have 3 worries. For reasons of time, I'll only run through 2 of them, but I would be very happy to chat about the 3rd one during Q&A. This is a sneaky technique. The first one is very clear, and it's just that it's a very ontologically inflationary account, in that there are a lot of data claims, one for every moment of time. Therefore, we need to have a corresponding multiplication of powers. And mind you that so far in talk I've only spoken about sort of non-fundamental macroscopic properties, but obviously the dispositionist believes that fundamental properties are also dispositional, and so there's going to be tons of fundamental facts which are dated. Now, I'm always a bit uncertain about how much weight sort of ontological cost arguments have. I'm just going to leave it there as ceteris paribus. We probably would like to have a linear ontology, but that again is definitely not a knockdown argument. It's just something like that. The second argument I think is a bit more consequential, and it is the idea that the dated manifestations are not compatible with some very attractive metaphysics of properties that a dispositionist ought to like, or at least can conceivably like. In particular, in this talk, I will focus on Platonism. So a lot of, Matthew Tugby has argued over the last 10 years or so that if you like an ontology of powers, you should really think that properties are Platonic universals. This helps us solve some problems about unmanifested properties and whatnot. And my argument here is going to be that you cannot think that properties are Platonic universals if you go for the dated manifestation strategy. Again, you might think, well, that's too bad for Platonic universals. We just have into a different ontology of properties, metaphysics of properties. Again, probably not a knockdown argument, but I think that it would be a bit, on one hand, I think that neutrality on grounds of ontology of metaphysics of property is a desideratum, or this ceteris paribus virtue. And the second one is that this one is a particularly attractive one. It's not one that I personally favor, but I think it's one of the strongest contenders. So very quickly, what is a Platonic universal? Platonic universal is a necessary existent, is non-concrete, and presumably it's not grounded, it does not depend for its existence upon being instantiated, and presumably it does not depend on anything else, or at least a lot of Platonists want to maintain that it's absolutely fundamental, and so not relatively grounded in anything else. Why doesn't it go well with dated manifestations? Here's a little argument. This is a bit of a sketch. It can be filled out slightly differently depending on your various assumptions about what you take to be space-time. But the first half is very easy. There are data truths, so we need data truth makers. If we buy the strategy, and if we buy into Platonic universals, this will mean that we need dated Platonic universals, right? Fairly easy. But I think this is a problem. I think that you cannot have dated Platonic universals, and this is the reason. Dated Platonic universals will be a property of the form roughly breaking at 5, dissolving at 3, that sort of things. And it seems overly plausible to me that these properties have the date as an essential component that is part of constitutively essential for a property such as breaking at 5, that it makes reference to the time as 5. It would not be the property that it is if it referred to a different time, right? And, well, if we buy into the sort of orthodox Feinean link between constitutive essence and metaphysical dependence, we might think that if something appears in my constitutive essence, then I metaphysically depend upon it. In some senses of metaphysical dependence, that is better to be precise at a later date. And the result, though, would be bad, because it turns out that dated Platonic universals metaphysically depend upon the date that they refer to, so a particular space-time point. And here, depending on different assumptions, there might be different reasons why we might not like this point. So we might think that, if we think that space-time is a concrete entity, it turns out that Platonic universals are dependent upon something concrete. This goes against the definition. If we think that space-time is a contingent existence, then clearly we have a problem because Platonic universals are supposedly necessary existence. Or we might just think that, look, Platonic universals cannot depend upon anything. They're all bottom rocks, so any kind of result is bad. Again, we might think that this is not too bad, that we just need to change our ontology, but again, I think it would be nice if we had an account that does not incur in this cost. This is the last thing that I will not talk about. So here's another account of dated manifestations, which I prefer a bit. I call it the duration strategy. And its core idea is childishly simple, and the starting point is to know that there is a temporal gap between the activation of a power or the occurrence of its stimulus and the occurrence of its manifestation. This is a thesis that Rani, Anium, and Stephen Mumford has dealt a lot about, and I find it fairly plausible. There is a temporal gap between when I hit the vase with a hammer and the vase shatters, or between you taunt me and I get angry, etc., etc. Obviously, different powers might have different gaps. And so the idea is to exploit this fact and just determine the date based on the time of the activation of the power or the occurrence of the stimulus, and couple with what I call a duration fact, that is a fact that expresses the gap that occurs between activation and manifestation, to yield us the data truth that we want. So I'm going to need a couple of ingredients. I think that they're all fairly plausible, apart from the last one, which I'll try to say something more towards the end. First of all, we need suitably generic powers, such as fragility as understood as directed at breaking, rather than anything more specific. This is something that everybody should be able to buy, so I will not spend any time on it. Then we need a precise time for the activation of the power. Now, based on your different theories of what powers are, you might interpret this differently. If we go for Alexander Bird's stimulus model, it's going to be the time of the obtaining of the stimulus. If we buy into something like Barbara Fetter's account, or Nancy Cartwright's account, we'll have to tell a slightly different story, but it's an unproblematic element. It's the time where the power starts to work, as it were. Then we need, and this is slightly more controversial, we need to have an independent arrow of time, in that if I know that there is a 5-minute gap between the activation of the power and its manifestation, I still need to know in which time flows or causation flows in order to know whether my sugar will be melted at 5 past midday or 5 to midday. In general, I think that a primitive arrow of time, an arrow of time which does not depend on powers is not problematic. I can either buy a sort of maudlin primitivism, or I'm pretty convinced that powers can buy the more David Albert, Barry Lower account of sort of reducing it to the past hypothesis plus statistical dynamics, so it's fine. The crucial element, though, the star of our show, is duration facts, right? The facts that encode how much time it should pass between the activation and the gap. So I think that really the duration strategy, I find it very intuitive, but its attractiveness will depend massively on how credible an account we have of duration facts, right? Exactly what do we think about them and how do we characterize them? And in the 5 minutes or less that I have left, I will try to give you a very broad sketch of it. I want to stress that I don't think that the strategy that I propose, the account of data truth that I propose, stands or falls with this sketch, in that I think that we just simply have to explore the logical space for duration facts and sort of offer a number of answers, and different accounts might be more suited than mine. This is just something that I like independently. And so I need to simply give very quickly an answer to a couple of questions about what the hell these duration facts are. In particular, are they grounded? Are they primitive? And do they govern the powers, or are they sort of a Humean description of some independent fact? And what I will go is a sort of essentialist theory about them. And this is a sort of mediate essentialist theory, in that I think that there is a middleman who is doing the work, and this middleman is processes. And so my proposal is to say that duration powers, I will argue that powers are essentially linked to processes, and that we can derive this duration fact from the processes that are linked with powers. So how does it work? So this is a two-step argument. I'll run through it very quickly. First, what does powers have to do with processes? Well, I very much like a distinction that Nancy Cartwright has been arguing for some time, that we need to distinguish between the activation of a power, or the moment in which the power starts to work, or the exercising of the power, and the manifestation proper, or the end result of that power. Let's say that we can think that when a massy object starts to exert its mass property, it sort of starts to create an attraction or a force that pulls massy object around, but this might not result in the two objects collapsing into each other, because I might just push one away with an overarching force or something like that. And I think that this holds across the board. Cartwright has very persuasive arguments that we need it to make sense of certain methods in empirical science. And I find it overly plausible. So I think that we need to distinguish between exercising and manifestations propers. And I find it overly plausible to characterize exercisings as telic processes that sort of link, whose end state is the manifestation proper. So the picture that I want to pitch to you is that when you activate a certain power, that is, a certain stimulus occurs or something like that, it begins a certain telic process, that is, a process which is directed to a certain end state. And if everything goes all right, if nothing interferes, we get to the end of that process, which we identify with the manifestation of the power. This, again, might be an event, state of affairs, property, whatever you want. Importantly, I think that these processes have to be part and parcel of the identity conditions of powers, in that I think that what sort of processes links the power in its manifestation does make a difference to the identity of that power. I can think of cases where we have two powers that have the same manifestation but leads via different causal processes to this manifestation. We can break a fragile object by putting it through a very rapid change in temperature, by hitting with a hammer, or by having it sung at by a powerful soprano, as Fetter has in an argument. And these are slightly different causal processes, and I think that they are therefore different powers. And so I think that we ought to have a richer characterization of the essence of power, or the identity conditions of powers, one that goes from a two or one variable model, such as P is directed to M, where the only variable is the stimulus. Obviously, if you like stimuli, you need to add those as well, to one that also includes processes. So I want to say that the essence of a certain power P is something like P is directed to M via a certain process. Second step, and this is the tricky one, I want to say that it is part of the essence of that process that it takes a certain time to unfold. And so a power is linked to its manifestation by some process phi-ing, and I want to say that, well, it is essential to phi-ing that it takes 5 minutes. And if we can show that, this is obviously not an argument yet, but this is a wish-washy thing to say, but if we can prove that, then we get duration facts for free, obviously, right? Because it then becomes part of the essence of the power. This seems, and I'm almost wrapping up here, this seems prima facie extremely implausible Because surely certain processes can take longer and shorter, and we can still have a type identity between them. And surely even powers in different situations take longer or shorter to lead to the manifestation. So how do we do that? And the trick that I'm going to use is to say, well, look, we just need to take collective instances in the get-go. So the picture that I've pitched to you so far is incredibly naive in that it acts as if powers sort of act alone and in isolation. But in reality, we know that powers usually require mutual disposition partners, as it were. They need other powers to collaborate with them in order to bring about an effect. And what I want to say is that while it is not essential to the process that links a certain power with a manifestation, that it takes a certain time, it might well be essential to the set or the plurality of its disposition partners, that it takes some time, that specific determinate time to unfold. The notion of collective essences, if you're not familiar with it, is meant to solve a bit of an embarrassment for Finian essentialism, in that it is necessary that Socrates is distinct from Plato, or I'm distinct from Nathan, and according to Finian essentialism, all necessities are to be grounded in essences, and yet it's clearly not part of me that I'm distinct from Plato, because otherwise we would have an extremely inflated essence which fights against the original idea. And so the gambit is to say, well, look, collective essences are in a way non-monotonic in that they can outstrip the individual essences of all participants, so it is essential to Plato and Socrates that they are distinct from one another. And my gambit is to say that the processes get a determinate sort of time value when we look at the collective essence of the mutual manifestation partners. Obviously, this is an extremely crude picture, but I find it more preferable than the mutual disposition, the dated manifestation model, because it does not encounter any of the other problems, in that this is perfectly compatible with Platonic universals. It's somewhat ontologically leaner, because duration facts sort of come for free out of our ontology. That being said, if you have any suggestion about how to make this better, or different ideas about what to do with duration facts, it would be highly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now,
So, yeah, thanks for that. Also nice that we're essentially distinct. I'm wondering if you're going to get a problem with the kind of tagging in the essence thing always means you're ontologically dependent issue coming right back up. So you're going to have to say, like, it's essential to this power, that it's compatible with these other powers. That's going to be part of the essence of the thing in order to get the kind of collective essence talk that you want. So now you have to have dependency, and you can get dependent loops. Do you see the issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you just drop that kind of it always goes downwards kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. So, two things. On the one hand, I'm very happy to say that all powers sort of depend on each other, in that I really like sort of broadly structuralist account of power identity, so I think that rather we need the whole graph. So I'm not too worried about that. Obviously, that doesn't sound that sounds somewhat uneasily for the Platonists, because we just want to say, look, there's nothing more fundamental, but then you can have sort of symmetric co-fundamental entities, which might be tricky, I agree, but I think that those are sacrifices that maybe the Platonist is willing to make. It doesn't strike me as bad as being dependent on space-time points, just because space-time seems somewhat more alien to Platonic universals, whereas two universals being dependent on each other, maybe it's more acceptable. That being said, I'm slightly worried about the dependence between powers and processes, because for a very simple reason, because I think that it's very easy to end up in a sort of definitional circle, because we then recognize that powers are also dependent on telic processes, but I also find exceedingly plausible when I need to characterize telic processes to characterize them in dispositional terms. And that's something like Brian Ellis has this whole account according to which the essence of processes are dispositions. And so obviously this can work, or at least my sketch can work, if I can give you a non-circular counter processor or sort of identity condition for processes. And that is a tall order, and that's what I'm a bit concerned about. It's not obvious that it cannot be done, but it's a nasty task. Thanks for the question.
So you backed away from a claim about the relationship between processes and their times. I'm not absolutely sure what the claim was that you backed away from, but it might have been the claim that if a process did in fact occur and did last for 2.5 minutes, that process, couldn't have lasted for longer than 2.5 minutes. If that is the claim you're backing away from,
yeah,
I urge you to endorse it and accept it. Peter Simons and I have been plugging this view for a long time. It always meets with incomprehension, which is based simply, I think, on the misunderstanding. On a misunderstanding, it's usually the case that the agents that produce a process, they could have acted differently. But the process itself, if it lasted 2.5 minutes, it couldn't have lasted half a second longer.
I'm very glad that there is somebody else who doesn't find this completely implausible. But yeah, it's something like that. I think that it's, at least when we take into account all the agents, all the exact circumstance where the process sort of comes about, then I think that it's somewhat plausible that that token process couldn't have lasted any longer or any shorter. Obviously, it's a sort of strong thesis to buy, so it might make a lot of people unhappy, but I think that, I don't know, it might be too much of a price to pay, but I find it somewhat plausible, yeah.
Thanks, that was very interesting. And I like your positive view, but this is a little bit of follow-up to Nathan's observation. I mean, just with respect to your slide that was on Platonic problems, the 8th premise there, if X is part of Y's constitutive essence and Y metaphysically depends upon X. I just feel like there are a lot of counterexamples to that. So, I agree that it would be odd for universals to have times built into them, but even if they did, I think, one might deny that premise. There's a couple cases I've argued for example, if X is an atom, if X is a molecule and Y is an atom, then, an atom might have as part of its constitutive essence that in certain circumstances it would enter into forming a molecule, but the atom doesn't depend on the molecule, right? Instead, vice versa. So I think that constitutive essence contain, propositions or properties, et cetera, that are such that it's of your essence that you would enter into creating them. They might not even exist. So, the dependence claim is odd. One last thing about that, I just think Fine goes that way because he's thinking of essence in terms of like definitions, where a definition has certain constituents, and the constituents are somehow more fundamental than the thing that's defined out of them. But when thinking metaphysically, I don't think that holds.
Yeah, thanks. I have to say that I wholeheartedly agree in that I've been long trying to work on a paper, sort of trying to deny this principle, which I think that, so I perfectly agree that there are counterexamples, and especially I'm particularly not very convinced by the somewhat stronger view that links as allowing that there is some sort of dependence in there. I do not think it's a building relation or a sort of small g relation, in that I don't think it has much to do with fundamentality. So even if we allow that I am somewhat metaphysically dependent upon being human, I don't think that that entails anything about being human being more fundamental, which for some version of this argument might be problematic. So the original form of the argument was based on a sort of supervenience claim, in that the general idea was to say that, look, Platonic universals, a necessary existence space-time is contingent, and so hence the problem without any need for the sort of Finean view. But then a reviewer started pointing out, but look, surely somebody can think that it's necessary, and so I tried to give the grounding version. But yeah, I'm very uneasy about that Finean principle as well, so thank you. Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that.
Thank you again. So for the second talk of this parallel session, we will have Max Sullivan talking us about lawlessness?
Hi. Okay. So I'm Mac. I came from a very long way to give this talk. My talk is going to be about the possibility of lawlessness. More precisely, the talk is going to be about the possibility that there are no contingent laws of nature. And the handout you have, hopefully in front of you, and ask if you don't have one yet, the handout you have in front of you isn't a complete survey of the talk, but it'll give you points to work off of when you ask your devastating questions during the Q&A I'm hoping to avoid by taking exactly 35 minutes. So the talk is going to unfold in more or less 3 sections. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to argue that it's possible that there are no contingent laws of nature. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to argue that if that's possible, then it's possible that something else is true. Then I'm going to argue that that something else is actually a really valuable test case for important debates in philosophy. Now, for various reasons, particularly because I care about them, I'm going to focus in, for the purpose of this talk, on the consequence of that possibility for the literature on causation and causal explanation. So I'm going to be discussing the kinds of theories of causation and causal explanation due to philosophers like Lewis and Scow and Strevens and Woodward. But it'll probably be obvious to the people in the audience how we can generalize the kind of lessons, if there are any, of my talk to other kinds of fields in philosophy. So this is a kind of, basically the talk is proposing that there's this kind of test case for a really important divide in the literature, and then suggesting that the test case tells one way. So in this first part of the talk, I'm just going to be arguing for what I said, which is that it's possible that there are no contingent laws of nature. And I'm going to argue for that in between 2 and 3 ways. The first point I'm going to make is just that according to various leading theories of the laws, it's possible, for all they say, that there are no laws or no contingent laws of nature. And I'm going to leave off that talk about contingency throughout here, but it'll always be a tacit rider on what I say. All right. So for instance, just to start at the beginning, suppose you adopted Maudlin's theory of laws from his 2007 book, which Maudlin, so there's obviously a whole technical apparatus here, but Maudlin glosses it as, laws like these fundamental entities which are responsible for generating the rest of his system. And at one point, towards the beginning of his paper, he calls them the bedrock. It's a familiar fact in metaphysics that for various kinds of entities, it's possible that in at least one well-defined sense, or many well-defined senses, there isn't any bedrock. So for instance, it's familiar, I suppose, to people in the audience, that it's possible that fusion lacks a bedrock. We call the possible worlds where that kind of fact obtains gunky worlds. Similarly, it's possible that, I gotta pick my words carefully given the audience, that metaphysical dependence of one kind or another lacks a bedrock. We call those worlds, to use Mike Raven's parlance, abyssal worlds, and so on. So similarly, if we understand bedrock in some sense as including the laws, it's going to be possible that there are no laws, and Maudlin never rules this out explicitly, at least not on the work of his that I've been familiar with. Similarly, so Lang identifies laws as being things with a certain kind of counterfactual stability. And it seems totally possible, of course, that there are possible worlds, at least given a suitably broad notion of modal space, according to which there aren't any sentences with that kind of counterfactual stability, right? There are worlds, sort of very unhappy worlds, perhaps very distant from our own, according to which any sentence that's true is also such that nearby worlds, the sentence is false. And nothing Lang says, I think, rules out that kind of possibility. And the third point, which I won't gloss here just for time, is that Lewis's theory of laws of nature also seems to me to allow for the possibility, maybe I will gloss it. So here's the argument that Lewis's theory allows for the possibility. This is the engagement with the audience portion of the talk. Here's the argument that Lewis's theory allows for the possibility of lawlessness. Again, the possibility that there are no contingent laws of nature. So in Lewis's view, just a gloss again, you know, a sentence is a law in a world if and only if it's a theorem of the deductive system which does the best job of balancing the competing virtues of simplicity and strength. I love the nods in the audience. It's like they hear, like, oh, Lewis 94. So you could think, well, suppose there's a world in which no sentence is related to any other sentence via you know, any kind of deductive entailment, or you know, no proposition where the sentence expresses is connected to any other kind of proposition via like the relevant kind of non-causal explanation, however you understand that. Then you might think, well, suppose we're trying to build the relevant kind of Lewisian deductive system at that world, or just maybe it's not a deductive system, but it's some kind of weaker system. The point is it's the best system, right? Well, on the one hand, we could add a sentence to that system, and we therefore offend against simplicity. But we wouldn't add really anything in strength, because of course, by adding a sentence to our system, we wouldn't therefore be able to entail any other sentences deductively. So we've added no power at the cost of simplicity. And of course, that point applies to any sentence we might add. So it looks like these kinds of worlds, if they're possible, are such that in those kinds of worlds, there won't be any Lewisian laws. And sort of, I won't reconstruct how that argument is valid here, but the point is there is a valid argument, which is such that you have to deny its premises in order to keep maintaining your belief that Lewis's view about laws is incompatible with there being these kinds of lawless worlds. All right. So the second thing I'll say is that there are actually positive arguments. This perhaps is more interesting. There are positive arguments that it's possible that there aren't any contingent laws of nature. So I'll just offer two examples of the kinds of positive arguments I have in mind. The first is an argument on certain kinds of numerical principles. So here's just a kind of principle I have in mind here. For any number of laws, it's possible there's one fewer. Suppose, this is false, suppose there are 4 fundamental laws of physics. You might think, well, there might have been 3. And that's the kind of principle which I think is plausible based on science, based on just like the kind of evidence which scientists inform us of. But if that kind of principle is true, of course, then iterating it pretty obviously entail the possibility that there aren't any laws. And there are various other kinds of numerical principles that are such that similarly they seem awful plausible, but using them perhaps iteratively will entail the possibility that there aren't any contingent laws of nature. The second kind of argument, there might not be any contingent laws of nature, just has to do with reflecting on modal space. So depends upon reflecting on the broadest flavor of possibility. So this is a very contentious question in recent modal metaphysics and modal logic. But to take one view that I think is really plausible, you might think the broadest flavor of possibility is such that something is possible in that flavor if and only if it's just compatible with certain kinds of logical principles, certain kinds of logical axioms. And if that's the broadest flavor of possibility, then it's just sort of obvious that these kinds of lawless worlds are possible because, of course, they don't conflict with the laws of logic, so they're possible. You might also think, and this is also a popular view, that the broadest flavor of possibility is such that something is possible if and only if it's compatible with those kinds of logical axioms plus certain kinds of metaphysical principles or laws. And again, if you hold that view, then assuming you think that there's not like some sort of weird gerrymandered metaphysical principle which tells you like there can't be no laws, then you should still think that this kind of lawless scenario is possible. Now, just to note one objection, certain people in metaphysics, certain leading people are influenced by a different view about the broadest flavor of possibility. And that view is the dispositionalist view. And depending on which version of that kind of dispositionalism you endorse, you might still have an objection to at least one, if not both, of these arguments that there could be no contingent laws. So the weak version of dispositional about laws entails one of the views I just talked about. So it says what the laws are and also what the possibilities are in the broadest sense of, in the broadest flavor of possibility, is determined by dispositional facts. But it's totally logically or metaphysically possible that things are otherwise than, for instance, the actual laws of physics dictate. So, it's true that E equals mc squared, but it might not be. On the other hand, a strong version of dispositionalism says no. In some sense, the broadest flavor of possibility is such that something is possible if and only if it's compatible with the actual laws, where that fact in turn is true because of certain kinds of facts about the dispositions which in some sense give rise to the laws. If you hold the weak version of disposition just spelled out, you won't have any objection to what I just said about it being possible that there are worlds without any kinds of contingent laws. But if you hold the strong version of dispositionalism, you will object. I won't spell out the argument, but hopefully it's clear what the kind of argument I have in mind is. However, I'm going to side for the purposes of this talk with the consensus that that kind of strong version of dispositionalism is too strong. It rules out various kinds of things that we think are possible. And so if you force me to choose between accepting the possibility of these kinds of lawless worlds and accepting this strong view about what possibility amounts to, I'm going to pick the first option rather than the second. But I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. Also to talk about the mysterious epistemic objection. All right, so second part of the talk. What I'm now going to argue is that if it's possible that there are no contingent laws, then it's also possible that in the scenarios where there are no contingent laws, there are still causal relations and causal explanations. And here I'm actually going to flip the script. So I presented the arguments 1, 2 on the piece of paper in front of you. I'm going to present the arguments now 2, 1. So just to give you a flavor of the kind of argument I have in mind for the possibility that there are causal relations or causal explanatory relations in these kinds of lawless worlds. Interesting. Also interesting. Less interesting. Such confidence.
That's because you were singing beforehand. It's suggested to sing.
That is not what Nat King Cole sounds like.
That is why you're with point 1 first and point 2 after. Mike didn't like that.
All's well? All right, continuing. All right, so now I'm going to argue that if it's possible that there are these kinds of lawless worlds, then it's also possible that there are causal relations or causal explanatory relations in these kinds of worlds. And the first argument is just this. So this is a kind of toy argument reminiscent of like metaphysics from the 1980s. I'd apologize, but I love that kind of metaphysics, so I won't apologize even a little bit. So it seems like the following is possible. It's possible there's like a super creature in these kinds of lawless worlds. The super creature is omniscient and omnipotent. So the super creature, in virtue of its omniscience, knows how to create causal relations or causal explanatory relations, even in these kinds of lawless worlds. You're like, that's super hard. And I'm like, yeah, it's omnipotent. So, no worries. But if that's true, then it looks like it's also possible that in some of those worlds it does create those kinds of causal relations or causal explanatory relations, or causes them to obtain. Deliberately being fuzzy here. And so it then looks like it's possible that there are these kinds of causal explanatory or causal relations, even in these kinds of lawless worlds. The second argument I have in mind is a little bit less recherché, but it's still out there. So I take it, so there are dispositions. I always start uncontroversial. There are dispositions. But there are also causal dispositions. And there are also causal explanatory dispositions. I'm going to start with a case which I feel regret in my heart actually using this because everyone's smiling and happy. Here's a causal disposition. Global pandemics have a disposition to cause despair. Ain't that the truth? So I take it that it's possible that something have that causal disposition, even in these kinds of lawless worlds, right? Thank you, Lorenzo. Something could have that disposition, even in the lawless worlds. But I take it that dispositions are associated with nested counterfactuals. So, for instance, the disposition to cause despair that the global pandemic instantiates is associated with the following nested counterfactual. If things were thus and so, then, if there were a global pandemic, then it would cause despair. Now, of course, there's like this massive controversy in the literature about whether or not thus and so can be spelled out in a non-trivial way. But the disagreement is not about whether thus and so exists. The disagreement is about whether or not thus and so can be specified in a way that allows for reduction. So grant me the claim that dispositions are associated with these kinds of counterfactuals. It seems to me that things could be thus and so, whatever that means, in these kinds of lawless worlds. And then it also seems to me that there could be a pandemic in these kinds of lawless worlds. So, if I have some modal logic, which I'll hand wave at now, but I'm happy to spell out during the Q&A, it just follows logically that it's possible that in these kinds of lawless worlds, there are causal relations. And that just follows from the possibility of these kinds of causal dispositions. And a similar argument, which I won't give for time, could be made about causal explanations. Now, notice, right, I've just given some possibilities, and I've argued from those possibilities that if there could be lawless worlds, then there could be causal explanations or causal relations to those kinds of lawless worlds. Here's something you can always do. Deny the possibilities I argued from. That's fine. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm just pointing out that there's going to be pressure on you, because I'm going to be able to give a lot of cases where we keep coming up with these kinds of metaphysically interesting bits. You're going to keep denying their possibility in these kinds of lawless worlds. What I'm looking for is a principled reason to deny all these things possibility, and for the life of me, I can't seem to find it. Okay, so let's wrap up with this third part. So far I've argued that it's possible that in lawless worlds, there are causal relations and causal explanations. Here's the finale. There's a huge disagreement, and again, I'm going to focus in on causation or causal explanation, though it's generalizable. There's a huge disagreement in the contemporary metaphysical literature between two camps. This has been identified by other people, and I'm going to use two terms to distinguish the camps. There's the minimalists, and there's the elitists. According to minimalists, if there's a causal explanation between two different events, or causal relation between two different events, just in case there's a certain pattern of counterfactual dependence. And according to elitists, there's a causal relation between two events, just in case there's a pattern of counterfactual dependence, and there's something more. Similarly, according to minimalists, there's a causal explanation of one proposition in terms of another, just in case. This is according to elitists, just in case there's a pattern of counterfactual dependence between the corresponding events and something more, whereas according to minimalists, there's a pattern of causal explanation between two propositions just in case there's a pattern of causal dependence between the associated events. And these are live views in the literature. So again, Lewis is a minimalist about causation, Woodward is an elitist about causation, Scow is a minimalist about causal explanation, and Strevens is an elitist about causal explanation. These are live views occupied by leading people in the literature. Now here's something which I won't have time to prove, but which is true. If the possibility I just argued for is correct, then elitism is false. Because the kinds of conditions, which for instance Strevens and Woodward say that causation or explanation satisfy, can't be satisfied in these kinds of lawless worlds, or at least not in some of them. But there are still causal explanations or causal relations in those worlds. So their views are false.
Thank you very much. Now, okay, 1, 2, 3.
I want to push back on what you said about Lewis's account of...
Go, yeah.
Do you want to speak into this, or can I just... No, so if we already have one sentence A in a system, and now we're considering whether or not to add logically independent sentence B to it, clearly adding B is always going to increase the strength of the system, because since B was logically independent of the stuff they were already, once we add it, now a system tells B, and it tells A and B, which it didn't tell before. So I'm not convinced by the argument you gave that somehow in this lawless worlds his account of laws breaks down. It seems to me that the problem is really another something different, which is that Lewis is always going to get laws, because there's always going to be a simple system, and in some worlds a simple system is going to be very, very complicated. And then we have some universally quantified planes that are part of that middle system. Vis-a-vis Lewis, isn't the problem really that his account of laws doesn't have an account of lawlessness? And since he always gets laws, rather than him his account being very waterly.
So that's a great question. So let me expand on what I said about Lewis. So my thought is that in these kinds of, so first I want to grant some of what you said. So my thought is that in these kinds of worlds, the person who is trying to develop a Lewisian best system is confronted with the choice between how much they care about simplicity versus how much they care about strength. And the way I see it, they have two choices really. They can either incorporate every sentence in those worlds into the set, which is such that if something says that it's a law, or they can incorporate none. And then my hunch is, if you're balancing simplicity and strength, you're going to go with the none view rather than the all view. And then there are difficult questions, I think, to ask about whether that's, like, not whether that's true, I think it's true, but I think about why that's true. But my thought is something like, if you're going to have, so there's going to be infinitely many true sentences at that world, and my thought is that, like, an infinitely large system of laws is always going to be, of fundamental laws, to be clear, of axioms, is always going to be such that we should prefer saying there are no laws, according to the simplicity versus strength maximization, to saying that. So that's the hunch that I'm starting out from there. Now that hunch might be wrong, but I just wanted to clarify my premise. And then I think that's super plausible. Stepping into this Lewisian mindset, which by the way I don't accept, but I'm saying if I accepted that, I think infinitely large set of laws versus none, if I'm simplicity versus strength, I'm picking the none.
Thanks, cool talk. I think that the issue that was talked about Lewis is sort of somewhat bigger in that I think that it's plausible that you can deny that there could be sort of governing laws. I don't think that you require much for an argument. It's just that they're contingent, so of course they could fail to exist. But I'm not so sure about descriptive laws in general, so Lewis is just an instance of that. Because if we think that laws are just at the description of some state of affairs as the world, regularities, in a world without regularities, it's just going to be the whole book of the world, right? And that's a bad law, a really bad law, but that's a law nonetheless. And we might not care about simplicity or strength and just say, well, look, this is just a very long sentence. And very similarly for certain dispositionalists who think that, look, we don't really have laws who have any oomph, but they're just sort of useful description of what the dispositions are doing, which seems something that is going on in your point too. In a sense, there are laws, right? This is sort of Bird and Mumford going for it. It's like, obviously they're not doing anything, but they don't need to because laws do not push stuff around. They're just sort of convenient shorthands. And if we're in a very unlucky world, then shorthands are fine. And so in a way, yeah, is that a good point against elitism? Only if laws are the missing ingredient, right? Only if it's philo are the missing ingredient, which is very much the case in like the case of servants, etc. But you might think that, look, it's counterfactuals plus dispositions, and those we have, right? Or counterfactuals plus some other regularities that we might have, in which case I'm not sure that elitism as a whole is destroyed, but yeah, I like your final point about certain accounts in the literature.
Right. So that's a really helpful question, and it has multiple parts, so I'm going to try to answer them quickly, but also in order. So the Lewis question, I take it that the reason why Lewis doesn't say anything like what you just said is that Lewis and I are committed to offering an account of laws which sort of recaptures our ordinary and also our scientific talk about laws. And so we certainly shouldn't say, for reasons that are sort of well covered in the literature in the 70s and 80s, that like laws are just any old kind of generalization. That's why Lewis appeals to simplicity and strength. And then my point is that once we start appealing to simplicity and strength, then it looks like, for the reasons that I made to Ulrich, it looks like, look, in these worlds, given the kind of hunch that I was relying upon earlier, there just aren't any laws. For like a principled reason, right? Saying that there were laws would give us less strength than it would violate against simplicity. Now, on your point about dispositionalism, I need to think about that more. But I guess it seems like, in some sense, and this is just a thought, so please don't. But my thought is, in some sense, we're talking past each other, because my thought is, be a dispositionalist. I love the view for all kinds of reasons. Barbara Vedder's a personal hero, but my thought is, a dispositionalist is still going to run into the horn that I set up earlier, right? Either they're endorsing strong dispositionalism or weak dispositionalism. If they're endorsing weak dispositionalism, their view is totally compatible with endorsing the soundness of my argument here, because they believe that various kinds of things are possible, which are such that they are contrary to the actual laws of nature, right? So that any weak dispositionalism, I'm good. If it's strong dispositionalism, on the other hand, there's like this growing literature of people are like, look at all these problems which come up for this denial of these things which obviously shouldn't be possible, but according to strong dispositionalism or not. And I agree with that consensus. So it's just so I want to hear more, and we'll talk over dinner.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so this is about your claim too, if it's possible there's no contingent laws, and it's possible there's no contingent laws, but there are still causal relations and causal explanatory relations. Just a couple thoughts, I just want to hear what you thought. I mean, the case that you described where there's some creature at such a world and somehow then they're able to foresee the causal relations, at least on many accounts of causal relations, you know, causal relations will bring the laws with them, okay? So in that case, it's not clear that you're describing, for the most part, for many accounts of causation, a coherent scenario. But I do agree that there are some accounts, for example, you know, I think if you look at dispositions, you have a dispositional account of causation, there could be dispositions, but then again, note that it can't be that the dispositions are reproducible, because that would allow for a law that would express, you know, what happens when the disposition is manifested, or, you know, like in certain circumstances. So what you need is a world where there's no contingent laws, and you have single case dispositions, ones that could never be reproducible, and they're more or less, you know, not unconnected, because if they were connected, there'd be laws. But then I think, so that seems, that's a real possibility, but it's not clear that it's a possibility that is going to undercut Woodward or Strevens. I mean, it's a really distant possibility, because it's not clear there's going to be the causal explanatory relations in that world.
Yeah, so that's a really valuable thought. I'm going to answer 2 points about it, I think, just for time. The first thing to say is, so I, of course, was sort of raised on a steady diet of peanut butter and jellies and David Lewis. So I think like Lewis 79 is like the most important paper ever written, particularly the postscripts. And so I think, I don't know that I agree with your claim. Like, I think if you endorse criterion 4 in Lewis 79, then you can still say there are relations of counterfactual dependence, even in these kinds of esoteric worlds, because criterion 4 and also criterion 2 don't mention anything about laws. And so assuming you offer like some kind of counterfactual account of causation, then it looks like there still can be various kinds of causal relations in those kinds of worlds, even though they're totally lawless. And so of course there's a huge tradition of people who follow in that kind of counterfactual account of causation, and therefore I'm sort of like, I'm on board with them. That's my thought. My second thought is just that, actually maybe we'll just end there. I can let Lorenzo just, so I'll end there, maybe talk more later.
Thank you again. So now we're going to have a coffee break in the cafeteria in front of the building, right by the exit where the registration desk is. And then we're going to reconvene here at 5:25. Thank you. Very well. So we come back after the break with a talk from Nathan Wellman, A Potential Contradiction. You have the floor, please.
Cool. I'm going to walk around and talk. I'll yell. Hopefully that's okay. Can everybody hear me all right? Awesome. If not, just do this. So first thing to apologize, maybe? I'll try and stay in the camera too. This is better.
The share, there's another camera back there, so you're already...
Beautiful. I mean, yes, but you don't want them to miss this.
If you can share the screen and speak in the microphone.
You can there is a WebEx window. Yep.
And the condividi. And your PowerPoint.
Yes. Awesome.
Okay, sharing, and please speak in the microphone.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Also radio microphone, but microphone.
Okay, cool. Yeah, nice. Few stumbles, but we're going. Place, I guess the first thing to start with is, this is kind of an older paper. I wrote it, God, I don't know, let's say 5 years ago. I kind of missed a couple years of research because of illness. So this was a good excuse to have a chance to kind of come back to it. Basically, I'm going to slate Barbara a little bit. It's good that she's only online, so she can't really respond. Well, actually, I know she can, but okay. So, love technical stuff. So, okay, I'm going to go real fast, Sonic the Hedgehog style. So, you know, we might be interested in providing something like an account of metaphysical modality. That is, a sort of story about the modal package. And I think these stories come in two types. So there's a fully reductive one. That's where we're going to get rid of all the modal notions, analyze them in terms of some non-modal thing. Lewis's genuine modal realism purports to be one, whether it's successful or not, I don't care. A more interesting thing, and this is what I think many people, especially here, are kind of after, is a partially reductive one. So this is where we take one of the modal notions and we kind of get everything in terms of it. So finding essentialism is one. A more recent one, I've already heard a talk from Giacomo about this, is a kind of dispositionalist story. So we'll take dispositional properties, whatever those exactly are, and we're going to get all the rest of the modal package from them. So it's not totally reductive, but it's partially so. And this dispositionalism looks kind of nice. It gives you a plausible ontology, or at least prima facie. It gives you a plausible epistemology, again, at least prima facie. There's a pretty obvious extension problem here, right? So one option is, hey, disposition gives you possibility and vice versa. Take the Golden Gate Bridge. It seems false to say the Golden Gate Bridge is disposed to break. Right? Maybe the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was disposed to break, but that's a different bridge. Right? But possibly the Golden Gate Bridge breaks. Right? So dispositionalists have to say something about this. Now, I don't think this is a huge problem, but at least kind of gets us to Vedder. Vedder comes along with a really ingenious story. And genuinely, if you haven't read her book, go read her book, it's awesome. Right? So Barbara's ingenious story is, let's ditch dispositions and let's talk about potentialities, potentials. And these extend beyond dispositions and abilities, but they include them. Now the structure of potentialities, which I'm not going to talk about too much, right, let Vedder get away from the problem I just said a second ago. And the key kind of idea for Barbara is this principle I've labeled possibility. So possibly P if and only if something has, had, or will have an iterated potential for it to be the case. There's a bunch of things going on here, especially about iterated, not really going to be relevant for us, but if you want to talk about it, you can ask Barbara tomorrow. Right. Now, once we got this, we can get all the rest of the modal notions. That's the hope. Now, I think Barbara's account is awesome, and I think it has a genuine kind of potential to be transformative. But as she says at the end of the book, we're at the beginning of this debate, not the end. So what I want to do is basically raise a particular problem that I think comes up for her view. Now, I've actually presented this to a few people before, Barbara included, and she showed me what she thought was the right way to respond. Half the time I think she's right, half the time I think she's wrong. The way I'm going to pitch it today is that she's wrong, but we can talk about it. Right? So here's the plan. There's going to be some background on Vedder's view. It's going to be a slide. It's going to go real fast. The key thing that I want to get out of Vedder's view is 5 commitments. And then when we bring these 5 together, I'm going to show you how that generates contradictory modal claims. Bad news. Then I'll talk a little bit about how to potentially solve the problem, why I think those don't work, and then we can all go home happy. So let's get on to the background. Here's the background. The key idea are potentials, potentialities. These are the potential to manifest some condition or situation or property or what you like. Right? They're linked with a can notion. Now here's the weird thing. Potentials, if they're really just tightly linked with this possibility thing, kind of explode. Right? So the Golden Gate Bridge has the potential to break. The fragile vase has the potential to break. But it feels like there's kind of a difference here. Right? How do we track the difference? And how do we maybe want to recover back the thing like, hey, it's false that the Golden Gate Bridge is disposed to break. So the idea, and this is the really cool idea, is potentials come in degrees. Right? So the vase has breakability or fragility to a greater degree than the Golden Gate Bridge does. But of course, it still has it to some degree, because it can break. So that kind of scale thing is the big, big idea. Now, here's the really neat thing. The scale comes with extremes. At the minimum end, you just don't have the potential. Right? You just fail to possibly do it. At the maximum end, well, the object has no potential whatsoever to not manifest it. I want to talk about these. These are going to be a problem. Okay, cool. Told you, background was fast. Here's the 5 commitments to the view. First one, objects can change what degree of potentials they possess over time. When I was younger, I had the potential to be a child actor. Not so much anymore, given that I wasn't. Similarly, right, we can think about these with regards to temporally indexed ones. These are going to come back. Right? But again, as time marches along, my degree of having the potential to be a child actor went away. Became less and less, eventually dropped to 0. Second commitment, some potentials are past concerning. Right? These are potentials, manifestations, going to be grounded in stuff that happened in the past. Right? So this might be because they feature temporal indices denoting earlier times. They could just have past tense, being a former child actor, say. Also not a potential I have. Right? Here's something cool. Whether potentials past concerning or not changes over time. The potential for being in Tilburg on 26 June 2022 is not now past concerning, but it will be a week from now. Cool. Here's the third one. Because we can't change the past, right, past concerning potentials are trivial, says Barbara. They're basically fixed. You have them to the maximal degree if you have them, and if you don't, then you don't have them at all. You have them to the minimal degree. So cool, no, those first 3 basically give us that sometimes a potential can go from a non-maximal to a maximal. Right? Just take any past one to the point where it's dropped away, or to the point where you have it and you can't go back and change it. Okay. Here's the 4th one. This is the bad one for Barbara. Right? What do we say about maximal potentials? Well, she says a potential is possessed to the maximal degree by an object just in case the object can do nothing other than manifest it. Now I read this as basically saying something like a weak necessity. Whenever the object's existing, it's going to manifest its maximum potential. Right? Okay. Here's the last one. It's that possibility claim that we saw earlier, the core commitment to Barbara's view. Okay, we got the 5. Now if we stick them together, we get contradictions. Here's how we go. I'll give you an easy run-up. So take the potential to exist and be in Tilburg today. Right? We all have that, or at least we all have it as the day kind of ticks along. Right now, though, we have it to a non-maximal degree. We also have its complement to a non-maximal degree. So possibly I'm in Tilburg right now, or possibly I'm in Tilburg today. If I really hauled ass, I could get home in time. And possibly I'm not. Now note I have this I'm existing because just to kind of avoid a complication, but it's baked in. Now suppose I spend all of today here, which, God willing, I'm going to. Note, throughout today, something weird happens to that potential. Or at least the two. The strength of one gradually goes up, and the strength of the other gradually drops. Right? As it becomes closer and closer to the end of the day, my potential to be in Tilburg becomes extremely weak. And actually, at the end of the day, something really metaphysically magical happens. Because as soon as the day clicks over, well, both potentials become past concerning, because they were about what is today, but tomorrow will be yesterday. And of course, the one that actually happened goes to max. And the one that didn't goes to min, that is, drops away. So the degree for not being in Tilburg raises to the maximal degree, on the assumption, of course, that I stay here all day long. Cool? Now we have a weird thing. Because per the necessity conception, remember that 4th commitment I mentioned? Well, I have that to the maximal degree, so I could not fail to manifest that potential. That is, it's necessary that if I exist, I ain't in Tilburg today. Now, why is that a problem? Because remember, a few minutes ago, when I said, not even minutes, 30 seconds ago, I said that at a certain point before today's end, I had it to a non-maximal degree, so I also had its complement to a non-maximal degree. Given possibility, that means it should be possible for me to exist to be in Tilburg. We've got a contradiction. It's possible for me to exist and be in Tilburg today. It's not possible for me to exist to be in Tilburg today, on the assumption, again, that I stay in dell'Aquila all day today. Note this readily generalizes. Just take any, at time t0, object A has the potential to P and the potential to not P, right? Where P features a temporal index denoting some later time t1, right? And then suppose at t1, A manifests P, right? Consider a later time t2, where P has become past concerning. Given triviality, right? A's potential to P is maximal, which means it's necessary. Right? But of course, given the earlier one where it was non-maximal, it's possible not. So, bingo. Okay, everybody get the problem? Yeah.
I find intuitive that when something is possible that it is, or that it is not.
Yeah, same.
So I don't see the problem.
I guess the
contradiction.
So the problem is, again, that basically when we take that maximal degree one, it pushes us into saying something like what I've labeled as form.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we can come back to it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the trick. Once we have the 5 commitments from Barbara, it looks like we're forced to say 1 and 4 are both true. Okay, so there's our contradiction. That's the potential contradiction. How do we fix it? All right, I'm going to quickly talk about 3 possible solutions. Here's the first one, and this is the one I think most people immediately jump to. look, hey, if potentials are temporally indexed, let's just make possibilities temporally indexed too. The response to that is, Barbara doesn't want to do that. So if we're trying to get Barbara's view, that's bad. She says explicitly that the notion of modality she's after is atemporal and timeless. She does not want to temporally index possibilities like this. I think also, like, whether we want to just talk about that, whether just make it a problem for her, but more generally, I think temporalizing possibility claims, especially like that, leads to some real logical issues. We can talk about that if people are interested. So I don't think this is a good way to go, though I think this is a very plausible and immediate response. Here's another move. Maybe we drop triviality. That was the problem. The kind of, hey, once they become like past the ones that you have, they're fixed to maximal degree. I think an issue with that is going to be, that suggests some things will have potentials to change the past. A lot of people will find that repugnant. I actually kind of like that. I think, I love this paper talking about changing the past. It's a really, really fun analysis paper. I would go read it if you have the time. But you know, if you think changing the past is okay, then cool, this is the way to go. If you don't, don't. Here's the solution that Barbara and Tim Button independently suggested to me. Was, hey, we kind of misunderstood what we meant by maximum potentiality, that kind of maximum scale. Right? Remember, I took the quote, and I read it as basically giving a kind of necessity conception, something like weak necessity. So I read it like what I have is A. But you might read it as something more like B. Now, what's the difference? Well, here what we're not just saying is that the thing exists, but it exists and has the potential. So we're allowing worlds where the object might exist and fail to have the potential. Say in the worlds where the past-looking one went the other way. I went to Tilburg today. Right? I fled after a terrible talk. Right? See the idea? I think this is a really cool and intuitive and neat potential way to solve the problem. Right? I'm not sure it really helps, though. And this is where, again, like, I'm pitching this as more negative than I think maybe it ought to be. So here's the thought. The first one is, look, if we look back at possibility, right, it mentions has, had, or will have. And it looks really weird when we look at our, that should be B rather than 2, apologies. Right? We look at B, it just talks about has. So surely all the tenses should get in play here too. Right? But of course if we do that, then we just get the problem right back again. So that's not so good. Because I can just run the problem. Now, okay, cool, maybe we don't like that. Maybe you think, no, it just should be has. I think there's still a lurking version of the puzzle or the problem. Because I can just run all of this and stitch in the potentials into the modal claim. Because I'll have iterated potentials to have these potentials. This is the only bit where iteration comes in. So I can basically get back a new fun version of the same exact problem and generate my problematic contradictions using the exact same machinery, even if we replace the necessity conception with this modified one. At least that's what I think, you know, the way the wind is blowing right now. I could be easily convinced the other way too, so I'm interested to see what you're saying. So that's basically it. So what I think has happened, right, is we get this problem from a combination of 3 things. Allowing an object's potential to go from non-maximal to maximal, right? Understanding maximal degrees in something like necessity, and then holding that an object's ever having the potential to f to a non-zero degree entails possibility. I don't see how Barbara can get away from these 3 things. They all seem to be kind of built into her story. So I don't really see how she'd get around the problem. Now, instead of a thank you, let me just invite you to come to Tilburg. So many of you will have come to the Issues in the Impossible conference we used to have in Bratislava. Martin has gotten a little sick of organizing it, so he's handed it over to me. There'll be a call for papers for this soon. Basically, I just need to get off my butt and write the stupid PhilSL email. If you like the stuff we're doing in this conference, we'll do more of it there. So yeah, come along.
Now, let's have some questions, and if someone from online wants to speak up, otherwise, maybe Barbara wants to, I don't know. If not, well, let's start with the one.
I don't know much about Weber's view, but why can't we say that potentials are forward-directed in time, so that when you get, like, as it were, things about the past, potential doesn't apply as such, and so it's not a maximal potential for actual things in the past.
Yeah.
And when we talk about what might have been, we're really just talking about past,
if not,
future-directed potentials. Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think so. One way maybe out of all of this is just deny that there are anything like what we call past-directed potentials. She wants to have them because she wants to talk about things like being a former child actor, which look like ones that things have. They had the potential, but they don't anymore.
Why can't that be a past forward direction potential?
Sure.
Sorry, just
No, I mean, I feel like this is a problem for her to solve. Okay. But yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Well, then Giacomo.
Sorry. Go ahead, I think, Barbara.
Sorry, I was watching the talk on YouTube because the quality was high, but that was slightly time delayed. So I missed some of the questions now in switching over to WebEx. So can you hear me okay, Nathan? I only see your belly.
Oh God, that's terrible.
Thank you so much, and thank you for engaging so thoughtfully with my stuff. I want to slightly elaborate on solution 3, I think, but maybe also change it a little bit. You were arguing that, sorry, I'm trying to keep track of all the things I've seen. When you talk about your principle B, what you call B, and the tenses, I think there's a very good reason for not having have had or has had or will have or something like that in principle B, because B is about potentiality. And as you pointed out, potentiality is something that changes over time. And so whether I have a potentiality now and whether it's maximal now is a matter of how things stand with me right now. And the reason I put the different tenses in the definition of possibility is precisely as it were to get rid of this sort of time relative, this kind of changeability or sort of relativity to times of potentiality. So, and then that's kind of similar to your third solution, and maybe it's just an addition to it, but I would again say that I don't think a maximal potentiality quite is a necessity, even a restricted necessity of the time type you're giving. At best, it's a time-indexed relativized necessity, indexed to the times at which the potential is being possessed. And I think that just falls out of the fact that potentials change over time, as does their degree, as you pointed out, with the sort of min-max thing. Sorry, are you having trouble hearing me?
No, we got it all figured out. Keep going.
Okay. feels a bit weird. So main point or question is, I don't think I should put the various tenses into the characterization of maximal potentiality, and if it gives me any kind of necessity, it's a time relative, and in other ways, relativized necessity. And then that would seem to, and I think that's okay, because I think I can get time relative modality out of potentialities. Sure. It's just that my goal in the book is a non-time relative modality, metaphysical modality. But yeah, you get the gist, right? I think I don't get a contradiction because the necessity is time relative, but the possibility isn't.
Yeah, so it's kind of like it's given that it is, it always will be, or something like this. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess what we can kind of see then, the puzzle is basically like, we need to be a lot clearer about how exactly to understand the maximum potentials. One other worry I might have there is this is really, really going nuts. But I think there might be some maximum potentials that objects have all the time. And then I can get a version of what I want and then have a problem. But I will have to think a little bit more exactly how to get that to happen.
I think in that case I would bite the bullet and say then we have a necessity, because then there is no potentiality for things to be otherwise. And I do have problems with sort of what happens at the very beginning of the universe and that kind of thing. So you might have an instance of that. But yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, cool. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I really loved it. And I'm really worried about the problem that you bring about. But I think that you have been maybe a bit uncharitable to the first option about sort of time indexing. Because if we want to build in the idea that potentiality change over time, which I think we should, then inevitably we will have to start from a sort of tensed and get the a-tensed or atemporal model claims out of generalization out of that. And I find it all very plausible that we might want to buy a principle of temporal logic such that if necessarily P, then always P, or always necessarily P, or something like that. And if you have that rule of inference, then we can sort of just deny that they are actually maximal. Like, suddenly becoming a maximal power becomes so much harder, right? So we might think that at T1, possibly P, and then at T2, we might want to say that, well, that's not really necessary, right? Because there had been a time where that isn't. And I'm not sure that that's completely wrong as an approach, in that you might think that, look, I need an intermediate step, right? Maybe I will need to quantify, to give you a universal generalization if I want to, over time, see if I want to get necessity or something like it. Yeah. And I think that it fits sort of well with the idea that getting necessity for dispositionalists is super hard.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that strategy one is obviously sort of the wrong way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think this isn't far off from maybe what
exactly
I was just sort of pitching. Again, I guess one really, really flat-footed response to it is, then I have a really hard time to figure out what maximal degree means. Because
that's the two of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is because I like boxes and diamonds. But it feels to me like I had a grip on what it means to have the maximal stuff when it was this weak necessity thing, and now you're taking that away from me, and I need an adult,
I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry, I'll ask. Is there a kind of Zeno's paradox when as you're sort of approaching the maximal potential, you never quite get out, and there's no reservoir, unless it's discrete? Is it a discrete process or continuous?
I think I don't know. I think there's going to be maybe some cases where you are going to get something like this, but I think the kinds of past directed potentials was talking about should have a kind of discrete cutoff point, but they don't have to, right? Yeah. It's a wishy-washy answer, but I think that's because it's sort of, again, something she has to tell you about.
Thank you again to Nathan Warman. Okay, so for our last contributor talk of today, Vasilis Limanios from the University of Cyprus. Can laws of nature be categorical properties?
Thank you, Lorenzo. My talk is about a problem that besets all governing laws, and especially the DTA laws, the Dredske, Tully Armstrong laws, the so-called inference problem. And especially it's about an objection that Alexander Bird expresses about the solution that Armstrong himself proposed about this problem, for this problem. In a nutshell, the inference problem is this. If we have a theoretically adequate view about laws, we should be able about at least deterministic and with no exceptions laws. We should be able to infer from the law statement it is a law that all F's are G's, the regularity statement that all F's are G's. Now, the objection is, the problem is that this inference cannot be justified if the truth maker for the law statement is what the DTA accounts say that it is. That's a higher order fact where the universal F is nomically related to the universal G. So this in a nutshell is the inference problem. The higher order fact is higher order, and the regularity statement is a first order fact. So we have a problem how we get from the higher order fact to the first order fact. Now, the inference problem has also a metaphysically more loaded version. A version that does not say something about the entailment between statements, but it said something about the metaphysical determination. And the problem is, in that case, how can DTA laws and governing laws in general metaphysically determine or produce the regularities we found in the actual world? Now, in a paper of 2005, Alexander Bird expressed a version of in the inference problem which focuses on the categorical nature of laws according to Armstrong. Now, the problem is this: if Armstrong, Bird says, if Armstrong assumes that NiFG, which according to Armstrong is also a first order structural property, as we shall see, is ontologically simple and entails the corresponding regularity, then according to Bird, he must accept that one of the most important for his theory natural properties has a non-trivial inherent model character. Alexander Bird holds that simple categorical properties cannot have such non-trivial inherent model characters, and so concludes from that any version of categorical monism is inconsistent with this governing role of NiFG, of Armstrongian NiFG. Now, Bird puts a dilemma. Armstrong has either to accept that the relation of nomic necessitation is not a natural relation, or admit that NiFG does not entail the corresponding regularity. Now, the first horn seems unacceptable for Armstrong because N determines the dispositions and the actual behavior of objects. And as a result, it must be a natural entity that corresponds to a universal, according to Armstrong. So Armstrong's only option seems to be to follow the second horn and reject the entailment. Now, Bird examines two ways to reject this entailment. The first way is to think that Ni merely implies the regularity. And the second way is that Ni contingently necessitates the regularity. Now, she rejected the first because laws seems to possess some kind of modal force, which is associated with their explanatory law, their ability to support counterfactual, and etc., which is unexplainable if N merely implies the corresponding regularity. It's just we have a constant conjunction between Ni, N, and the regularity. Bird also says that the second way does not work. The contingent necessitation, which is a kind of necessitation which has a strength between the string necessitation and contingency, Because he shows that this move leads to a vicious regress. I cannot say more because of the lack of time here, but this is the reason for Bert to reject this second option. Now, as we say till now, Bert's argument presupposes that NFG is a simple categorical property according to Armstrong. Now, Lewis once famously says that whatever n may be, I cannot see how it could be absolutely impossible to have NFG and FA without GA. The important is the parenthesis here. Unless n just is a constant conjunction or constant conjunction plus something else, in which case Armstrong theory turns into a form of regularity theory he rejects. Now, one may be inspired by Lewis' point and hold that NFG is not a simple categorical property, but is in fact a complex entity, a complex property, of which RFG is a constituent, where RFG is a relation that holds between F and G when the corresponding regularity holds. Now, since all complex universals bear model relations to their constituent universals, irrespective of whether we conceive them as dispositional or categorical, it seems that Armstrongian laws, if we conceive them as complex first-order properties, can be categorical even though they entail regularities. Now, Bert anticipates this response and says and points out that if we say that RFG is a constituent of NFG, then there must be an X such that NFG is equal RFG plus X. Now, X is either modally related to RFG, that is, either entails by itself RFG or not. Now, if the former, then effectively n equals X, and we fail to explain the constituents of n. If the latter, then we have, in fact, a view which says that NFG is a combination of R and plus something which is totally independent of the regularity R, which, as Bert notes, is nothing other than a version of a regularity theory of laws, something Lewis has already said. And of course, Armstrong himself has convincingly argued against the regularity theory of laws, so it is a problem to say that. Now, let's go back to Armstrong's mature account of laws. Armstrong's key idea was that laws are first-order structural properties that involve, in a sense, causal connections at the property level. And these structural properties are instantiated by causal sequences of particulars at the first level. More precisely, for Armstrong, the nomic connection is a causal connection between states of affair types, where for our purposes, states of affair types, we can take them as universals. They have differences, but they are not crucial here. A law is a first-order structural universal, which for Armstrong is a conjunction of states of affair types. And as I said before, a law structural universal is instantiated by singular causal instances. Now, if we put in parentheses that part of Armstrong's view that which identifies the nomic necessitation relation with the causal relation, that has to do with another problem, which Van Frassen calls the identification problem. So let's put in parentheses that part of Armstrong's view. Then, what remains and what matters for our proposals here is that Armstrong proposed that the law is a first-order structural universal, whose instances are parts of the corresponding nomic regularity. And Armstrong claims that the metaphysical version of the inference problem can be solved in the context of that proposal because the metaphysical determination of the regularity is nothing other than the instantiation, the usual metaphysical notion of instantiation of a structural universal. Now, is there a problem with it? Given Armstrong's own view about laws, I think that the most plausible explanation of the complexity of NFG is not what Bert proposes, that NFG is RFG plus something else. But it is that F, G, and the nomic necessitation relation N are the constituents of the law structural universal. So this is an important point because as we said before, the Bert's argument relies crucially in the assumption that the complexity of NFG is due to the fact that we have a regularity fact or a regularity relation in RFG, which is itself a part of NFG. But in Armstrong's view, F, G, and E, I think F, G, and E are the most plausible constituents of the law structural universal and not R, F, G. So it seems that Bert's assumption seems largely unmotivated in that context. And his objection boils down to this question. Can there be modal relations, necessary connection in this case, between the instances of a first-order categorical law structural universal and the instances of the nomological related properties which constitute the corresponding regularity? Can there be such modal relation? And I think the answer is yes. Because this necessary connection between the instances of a structural universal and the instances of its constituents exists for all structural universals, regardless of how we conceive them, regardless if they are, whether they are categorical or dispositional structural universals. So, unless one has extra reasons to think that a law structural universal is an exception to this rule, it seems to me that there is nothing especially problematic concerning this necessary connection between the law structural universal and the instances of that universal. Hence, if we have the right account of the complexity of the law structural universal, it seems that there is no extra reason to think that the fact that a law structural universal metaphysically determines the corresponding irregularity is problematic, even if the law structural universal is a categorical feature of the world. Now, one might object that Bert's objection is something else. One might think that Bert said that there is no metaphysical explanation of any necessary relation between the low structural universal and the corresponding regularity. And so the issue is not whether they can be necessary connection, as I interpreted it, but rather that if one is a categorical monist, cannot explain the existence of such modal relation unless she rejects her own view. So one can construe Bert's objection as an explanatory demand, as a demand for a metaphysical explanation. But I think in that case, first there is an easy and quick response to that. The easy response is that we can take this necessary connection as a modal brute fact. Stephen Barker and Benjamin Smart have already proposed that the necessary relation between a low structural universal and its corresponding regularity can be a modal brute fact. So Ashley Coates in a recent paper suggests the same. Both say that there can be such a necessary connection, but this connection cannot be in the essence of low structural universals, because it seems that the problem is that a categorical property cannot essentially have this relation to another property. Yeah. Now, I think that we can answer this objection on behalf of any prospective defender of the Armstrong view. I don't have time to defend the view, but I just say it, and perhaps in the Q&A, I say something more about it. I think we can have an essential explanation because we can attribute a modal conditional essence in the low structural universals. In this form, a low structural universal is essentially such that necessarily, and that's why it's a modal essence, necessarily, if n is instantiated, then an instance of n is identical to an instance of the regularity corresponding to R. Based on the attribution of such an essence, we can have an ultimate essentialist explanation of the fact, so we can meet the explanatory demand. Of course, there are problems. And one of these problems is the ones I said earlier. Can we attribute an essence to a categorical property such that such property can necessarily connected with another categorical property? I think that the view that categorical properties cannot essentially be connected to other properties holds only for simple categorical properties. If we have complex categorical properties, we have every reason to think that it is of their essence to be connected to their constituents. So there is no problem here to attribute such an essence to a low structural universal. Okay, but I stop here and thank you very much.
So, if there are, oh, Giacomo.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I guess that one way in which we might not like the sort of essentialist solution that you propose is to question how much of a governing role they might have then, because you might think that, look, I perfectly agree that if a complex is sort of essentially related to its components and that doesn't violate Hume's dictum or anything, but then you might say, but does it yield the kind of explanation that Armstrong wants law to give of the regularities? Like, laws are supposed to sort of determine and govern the regularities, and I think that it seems very natural to me to think that only two things that are unrelated, that sort of are wholly distinct, can do that. In which case, like, your solution clearly works, but it maybe not the kind of governance that Armstrong was looking for initially. Is that a problem, or have I misunderstood?
I think this has to do with how one conceives the metaphysical determination of the production, because in a sense, the instantiation of any universal metaphysically produces a regularity, in a sense. Because a universal have many instances, and all these instances resemble each other, you have a regularity. And this regularity, you can say, is metaphysically determined by the instantiation of the universal. So, in a sense, one can say, okay, this is an explanation. Perhaps because it is an essentialist explanation, is an ultimate explanation. So you don't have to dig deeper in that case.
Okay.
Hi there, thanks so much, that was very interesting. I have a clarificatory question just about the motivation for thinking there's an inference problem. For some laws of nature, those are presumably causal laws of nature where first you have an F and then F causes a G. But surely, if the world were to end right after an F were instantiated, then there would not be a G. So it seems to me that for causal laws of nature, it would be unwise to assume that there would be any kind of metaphysical entailment of the connection expressed in the law to, the associated regularities. This is probably not to, I don't think this is getting at the deeper question of why it would be that there could be even ceteris paribus regularities, where the law, really we should be understanding the law as saying that if there's an F, then ceteris paribus, there'll be a G, or something like that. But it just struck me as kind of an odd artifact of this, that there's supposed to be this metaphysical necessitation, and I just was wondering what you thought about that.
Okay. There's a lot of discussion about the existence of ceteris paribus laws, whether at the fundamental level we can have ceteris paribus laws, or we found them only at the higher levels. Perhaps all the discussion has to do with the fundamental level, where there are some arguments that at that level we don't have ceteris paribus laws, we don't have exceptions, and perhaps, despite quantum mechanics, we have determinism. Because the Schroedinger equation, one can see the Schroedinger equation as a deterministic equation. So I think that the inference problem is important for anyone who thinks that the laws are governed in some sense. And I'm not sure that the necessitation should be so metaphysically robust in order to have a problem here. Perhaps the necessitation, as Samson says, is simply instantiation. Perhaps the instantiation relation is problematic enough in metaphysics. So I think that all depends about how metaphysically, how metaphysical oomph wants one to ascribe to this determination. Okay. But I think that the problem for all those who think that laws are governed is important. That's why I discuss it.
Okay. I think we still have 1 or 2 minutes. Well, if not, I think we can thank.
But
please.
The point is that if we have a problem with Armstrong account, it has nothing to do with powers and dispositions and categorical property. It has to do with problems with structural universals, which have enough problems by themselves. So anyone who wants to defend this theory, she has to provide some answers to these metaphysical problems, which Lewis has famously brought to the fore, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Hello. We have our last invited speaker for the day, which is Roberto Ferrario, which is going to talk us about social ontology for the sake of trustworthy AI. Please.
So good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for having stayed till the end. Well, it's not really the end. You still have 45 minutes to go. Well, you're free to run away if it gets too boring. I hope not, but you're free in case. I'm wearing this yellow shirt so that you can recognize me afterwards, because the organizer puts on the website a photo of 20 years ago with long hair on the beach. So but that's my fault. I didn't ask to change it. So with the yellow shirt, you can recognize me. I come from the Laboratory for Applied Ontology in Trento, which is part of the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technologies. And as a short premise, I would say that this talk will be a little, let's say, borderline with respect of what you're used to, I guess, because it's not completely a talk in analytic philosophy or analytic ontology. Let's say that it's in between philosophy and computer science. In fact, this is a kind of, let's say, double-faced thing for us, because our papers and presentations usually look too superficial to philosophers and too unnecessarily too heavy for computer scientists. So I will try to stay on this line even with this talk. And also the style of talk will be a bit different. So I would invite you to interrupt me for clarification questions. Maybe I won't arrive at the end of the slides, but this is not really important. Also because the last slides are those a bit too sloppy. But I mean, please interrupt me if there's something to ask. I will feel free to not to answer if the question is too complicated. So now that we have this friends agreement, I will start the talk. This one, okay. So this is the outline of the talk. So since, as I was saying, what I do is slightly different from, I guess, what you're used to, I will start with an introduction on what formal or computational or applied ontology is. And these are, let's say, three ways of calling the same thing. Formal ontology is formal in the sense that we use formal logic to represent domains of interest. It's computational because usually ontologies in this computer science sense are meant to be implemented in information systems. to allow some kind of automatic reasoning, and applied because it's not pure ontology in the sense of the philosophical ontology metaphysics, but it's more applied to computer science. Then I will try to underline what are the similarities and differences between the two enterprises, the philosophical and the computational ontology. And I will then focus on ontology of organizations. And I've organized the talk in a way, I will start with some open issues from the point of view of computational ontology, and I will try and show how the philosophical analysis helps us to deal with some, let's say, conceptual problems. And this is what is in the fourth part, ontology of organizations, some proposals. So some proposals that we have developed at the lab. I won't enter into, deep details in this case because, formulas are a bit boring when presenting on the screen. But I will try to give you the flavor of what we use from philosophy to model in computer science. And then the sloppy slides at the end, these on social materiality. There is an account developed mainly in sociology, which I didn't start the timer, okay. That is found very interesting because it deals with some aspects that I believe are kind of not really focused on especially in the computer science analysis, but also in the philosophical one, especially the analytical one. But I think they are really stimulating for dealing with organizations. So this is not really a proposal, the last part, but something that I'm starting thinking about. And I think it could be of interest for some of you if we arrive at the end, because, for instance, the first invited talk of today, the one of Jessica Wilson, that was on different topics, but with a lot of similarities. The problems that emerged for me when looking at social materiality are really very similar to the ones they are dealing with. So let's start with this introduction. If I'm shouting in the mic, make some gesture because I don't hear myself very well. So I will start with a definition of formal ontology that was given by the former, let's say, head of my lab, Nicola Guarino, who's among the founders of this approach of applied ontology, together with some philosophers like Barry Smith and also Kevin Mulligan, who's not here now. And so they start, it's interesting because he didn't start from a philosophical, let's say, background. He's an engineer. But by talking with philosophers, also with, for instance, Pier Daniele Giaretta back in the 90s, he started being interested in this philosophical analysis and developed this new discipline within computer science. So this definition, I'll read it because I think it encapsulates all the main things we're working on. So formal ontology may be seen as an information object or an engineering or computational artifact because in the end it gets implemented into the information systems, composed of a vocabulary of terms used to describe a certain portion of the reality, what in computer science is called the domain, not only in computer science, but and a set of assumptions which are expressed as formal axioms. And these are aimed at making explicit the intended meaning of the terms of the vocabulary. This, is very important in computer science. It started to be important in the 90s when they started to put together information systems that were designed by different designers and needed to interoperate, as they say in computer science. But I think it's gaining even more importance now that we are dealing with very quick development of the artificial intelligence devices, and especially of a part of artificial intelligence devices that are mainly based on machine learning and on techniques that are not really transparent. And the idea is that formal ontologies were meant since the beginning to give more transparency to information systems design. And I think this is very important to, let's say, on a sense, to make human users aware of how the systems work, but also on the other hand, to spot possible biases that these systems can have. Because once that you have made explicit the assumptions you start from, you can at least start trying to figure out if there's something that is not really, let's say, fair. What is applied ontology for? So the applications are manifold. Basically, the main say interest of applied ontologies is knowledge of representation in engineering. So you use ontologies to represent the knowledge that certain agents have on a certain domain. They are used for database design and integration, for information retrieval and extraction. And the areas of application are, let's say, in principle infinite. You can apply it to whatever if you want. The most common are on natural language translation, medicine, mechanical engineering, electronic commerce, but really, I mean, I wouldn't put limits to the application areas. How it works? Okay, this is really very compressed, but just to give you the idea. So the idea is that the first thing you do when you start to build a formal ontology is you try to single out which are the main entities of a domain, and you choose these as the categories of the ontology that you're going to design. And the first thing you reason about is how they are connected with generalization, specialization, hierarchy. So you build a sort of, let's say, tree-like structure in which you put the main entities of the domain that are also called primitives in ontological, formal ontology terminology. Then there is a second step that's for, let's say, for the approach we are adopting is really central and is also the one that is most connected with, let's say, philosophical ontology, which is the ontological analysis. This one, I mean, on computational ontologies that are really, let's say, undefined, not really definable thing, because, for instance, you can see it as a very complex and expressive artifact. But what computer science usually talk about when they talk about computational ontologies is something that is much simpler. So this part of ontological analysis sometimes is a bit disregarded. This is why I'm really focusing on it, talking with philosophers. In the ontological analysis phase, you try to give definitions of the entities that you have singled out in your taxonomies. And these definitions have to be as precise as possible, even if expressed in natural language terms in this phase. So that's why we are leveraging definitions taken from philosophy. So for instance, from the theories of essence, of identity, of space, time, constitution. Because as you surely know, I mean, philosophy, and in particular analytic philosophy, is really concerned with subtleties. And subtleties usually are what helps you to, let's say, discriminate conceptually entities in a domain. So this part is what we are mainly focusing on in the lab. This part and also the following one, but that is really strongly connected with ontological analysis, which is the modeling. In the modeling, you take the definitions that you have given maybe in natural language, and you translate them in logical axioms, so in formal languages. And these can be at different level, let's say, of expressivity and of tractability. So for instance, in our lab, we're mainly concerned, let's say, with more expressive languages like first-order logic, because these allow us to, let's say, account for the subtleties. But once that you have to use them in an information system, you usually deal with fragments of these languages that are tractable so that the machine can use. So for instance, the most common language used in formal ontologies is OWL, which is web ontology language, which is a fragment of first-order logic that is tractable. So this is not so interesting, but just to... And again, very sketchy, but once that you have what we call an ontology, because here again there is a mismatch in terminology, because we call ontology, let's say, the first one of these three bullets, while people working in the semantic web call ontology the whole, let's say, system. But anyway, this is not important for the sake of this discussion. But when you have to introduce your, let's say, the theory you have developed into an information system, this is, let's say, composed of three, let's say, components. The first one is the so-called T-box, which contains the terminological knowledge, so what I was talking about so far, So let's say the assumptions that are the basic assumptions of the general laws that your domain, that structure your domain. Then you have what is called the A box, so the assertional knowledge. So you instantiate, you populate the ontology, we say in our dialect of a formal ontologist. And then you have a reasoner, let's say a piece of software that infer new knowledge from the one that you have given with your assertions. So just to give you a stupid example, you can think of having a terminological box in which you have sentences like all ontologists are human beings, all human beings have a brain or a head. Then you have an assertion of knowledge part in which you have sentences like Roberta is an ontologist, which is debatable, but you can say whatever you want. And then you have a reasoner that tells you that since Roberta is an ontologist, Roberta is a human being and she has a head. So it gives you, in a sense, new knowledge, new for the system, which is not so intelligent as they say, but that it is inferable from the knowledge you're already inserted. Formal ontologies are used in many, many domains. What is more interesting for me in particular is how they're used in the so-called multi-agent systems. Multi-agent systems are systems composed of heterogeneous artificial agents, and these are heterogeneous under many points of view. So, and you can see, for instance, an e-commerce domain as composed by many heterogeneous agents. And these usually can use different languages and protocols to communicate, so you need rules to translate the language of one into the other. They can be built by different designers, so they can be based on different conceptualizations, and possibly they can interact with humans. So for instance, in the example of e-commerce, you have a human being inserting questions into the system. And this is why they should be interoperable, as I was saying, so they should have some kind of way to express the assumptions they start from in order to be able to communicate. I also like this idea of multi-agent systems because in a sense we can think about organizations as multi-agent systems. Organizations, especially nowadays, can be composed by human agents, artificial agents, material devices, virtual mechanisms. So you can model all these things as a multi-agent system. And the artificial agents that can be working within these systems must be able to represent the physical or virtual environment in which they operate, their own knowledge, the knowledge of the other agents, being they artificial or human. They must be able to represent the system as a whole, and they must be trustworthy. The trustworthiness within these systems should be at the systemic level. And this is something, I want to introduce here because I think it's very important for the modeling of organizations, especially organizations in which you have artificial and possibly autonomous artificial agents. Because one of the main issues with artificial intelligence today is that of trustworthiness, but it's already widely recognized that trustworthiness cannot be dealt with just by having devices that are trustworthy, whatever trustworthiness could mean. The problem is that these devices are interacting with humans, and not only with individuals, but with possibly communities of humans. And so it's necessary to, let's say, to use a perspective that is as systemic as possible. And I put here into parentheses socio-technical because this is something very old in the computer science literature, but still very actual. So you have to take into consideration both aspects, social and technical. But this is something I will elaborate more later. So philosophical versus computational ontologies, which are the similarities and differences. So we'll start again with a quotation, this time from Achille. And he distinguishes in this now old quotation, because it's 2011, between philosophical ontology and metaphysics. I mean, very briefly, he talks about ontologies with respect to, let's say, a kind of inventory of all the entities that exist. And he talks about metaphysics to refer to all the inquiries that are meant to inquire what these entities are. And so, in a sense, according to Barthes, metaphysics wants to specify the ultimate nature of the items included in this inventory that ontology gives you. This has a lot of resemblances with what we do, even though we are not, as a let's say, computational ontologists, we're not really interested in the nature and structure of the reality in itself, whatever reality can be assumed to be. But we are more concerned with the structure of a system and the way in which the entities that are represented by the system are connected. This is because what exists for the system is, in a sense, what we choose to represent within the system. So what we are concerned with is not as much, let's say, the metaphysical nature of the things, but the conceptual nature of the entities that are represented in the system. The main difference between, the main characterizing aspect of computational ontologies with respect to many other approaches in computer science is that the focus is not on how the information within the system can be easily retrieved. So, I mean, usually computer scientists tend to organize information in a way in which the system, it's easy to recover it. But the information is organized in such a way that it can be as similar as possible to the domain that is represented. This is because they are meant to be used by human beings, so they should, in a sense, respect the way in which human beings conceptualize the entities that the system deals with. Obviously, this is not something that can be done precisely and once and for all, but let's say, again, philosophy for a formal ontologist is a help to understand how to organize information in order to make it as more understandable as possible for human beings. So we need to build a theory. We need to build a theory that is inspired by the philosophical debate. And again, as I was saying, with formal ontologies, we want to represent and express the relevant entities and relations that emerge from observation of the systems and of the environment in which the systems operate, and not the entities, let's say, in an absolute sense, but those that are useful for the purposes of the modeling. For this reason, the pragmatic, cognitive, and linguistic aspects are particularly important for formal ontologies, more than, let's say, the metaphysical level of analysis. So, turning to organizations, which are the questions that are of interest for people in, let's say, formal ontologies who want to model organizations? There are many questions that arise when you analyze an organization from many points of view. And these are all questions that are interesting when you start modeling. So how are organizations born? What happens when an organization is born? What is necessary in order for an organization to be born? And what kind of relations does it entertain with its founders? And as you see, many of these questions are also interesting from a philosophical point of view. So how are collective actions performed is a typical question that arises also in philosophical debate. Which relations do organizations entertain with the actions of the individuals who participate in a collective action? Agents here stands for organizations, but anyway, can organizations be considered agents of some kind? Because being a collective, it's not so clear if they are really agents or agents in a strong sense or in a weak sense. How can organizations act in the world? Who is responsible for the actions of organization? What can organization, what can they do or what they cannot do? These are all questions that we want to answer when we start modeling organizations with a formal ontology account. Some of the aspects that are interesting are, let's say, those that concern the structure of the organization, so which kind of relation are there between an organization and its members, what is necessary for a certain agent to be a member of an organization, what is the relation between the roles of organization and the normative layer, so the rules that define the roles within the organization. These are all questions we want to answer. And again, these questions, as you say, are very, very connected with the analyses that are developed in social ontology, in philosophy. So, for instance, one of the main topics for us is concerning collective intentionality and agency. Is this agency and intentionality reducible to the individual level, or do we have to postulate a kind of primitive for collective intentionality and agency? There are some limitations, though, for us, for our interest when we look at philosophical debates. For instance, this one on the reducibility very often is focused on small and unstructured groups where people already share many, let's say, many common assumptions. So the epistemic access to the other members of the collective mental attitudes is easier with respect to very complex organizations. Usually the examples made in collective intentionality in philosophy are more focused on these small groups. And very often they are limited to groups composed only by human beings, while for our purposes it's very important to understand what happens when these complex agents are a kind of mixed entity with human and non-human components. However, let's say in the last years, there are some approaches that are starting to be developed also in philosophy on these aspects. For instance, lately I had an email exchange with David Strohmeyer, who's really focusing on this, let's say, hybrid aspects of human and non-human within social groups. Another hot topic when trying to model organizations with a formal ontology account is the persistence of organizations through time, both from the, let's say, structural and concrete point of view. Here with structural, we intend kind of static description of the relations between the components, the abstract components of the organization, let's say the roles and the sub-organizations, and the concrete component that is the one that enacts the dynamic aspects of the organization, the embodied perspective. So for instance, which are the relations of the players of the roles within the organization, the relations between let's say, the human beings themselves playing the roles and the relations of the human beings with the role they play. All these things are important to elucidate when starting to model. And also, both these aspects, the static and the dynamic one, incur changes, and we want to be able to represent this. So we want to represent both the fact that you can have the same role played by different persons at different times, but also the fact that you can change the structuring of the organization. So you can decide to add roles, to add sub-organizations, to eliminate roles. And this is something we want to be able to represent. In order to be able to represent all this, we need to have a criterion enabling the re-identification of organizations through change. As we will see, we are taking inspiration from some approaches developed in philosophy to deal with it. So, okay, I skip this because it's what I was really talking about at the moment. And some of these problems can be dealt with by leveraging some of the theories developed in analytic philosophy. For instance, okay, the typical Searlean approach given by the count as relation, so x counts as y and c, is useful to represent the roles of the organizations, for instance. And it's interesting because there is also this dimension that at the basis of this, let's say, let me call it technique, even if it's not really a technique, you have a kind of epistemic act that is at the basis of an ontological, let's say, an ontological reality. So the fact that with an epistemic agreement you can create a new entity in your domain, it's really something that we need to represent in our system. So this is one of the things we can use to model organizations. Another one is the notion of quantity. So having entities in which you have, let's say, a hylomorphic approach in which you have the form and the matter, and you can represent them together by giving existence, let's say, to another entity. Existence for us, as I was saying, is simply, having a new entity in the domain. So for us, it's important when dealing with organization, being able to talk about, for instance, a person who are playing a certain role. And this allows us to deal with a lot of paradoxes that can emerge in the modeling of organization. So how have we used some of these suggestions taken from the philosophical debate to model organizations? This will be very dense and let's say dense, but at the same time superficial, because I won't go into the details of the modeling. But I would like to give you the flavor of what we do in the end. So in this old work in 2004, we started with the idea of modeling roles within organization. And as I was saying, the first step was to try to list all the properties that we wanted to represent of roles. And we started from this work of Steinman in 2000 that is more on a computer science, but it highlighted which were the main properties with respect to the other entities of the domain that were ascribable to roles. So one of the properties is that a role can be played by different entities. The same entity can play different roles simultaneously or at different times. An entity can change role and play the same role more than once. And also important is the fact that roles are intrinsically relational. So when you define a role, you cannot define it by itself. You have to highlight the connections with the other entities with the other roles in the description of the organization. And also they cannot act themselves, but they need entities who can act and that are the players of this role. And again, just to give you the flavor, but in order to represent this, we came out with a definition that was translated in first-order logic. So for instance, one of the things we can say about roles is that they are anti-rigid, so they're not, let's say, essential properties of the players, but they are properties that can be held at some time and not at other time. And for instance, in this case, we describe the role as anti-rigid in the sense that at any time, for any time an entity that is classified under this role, there exists another time in which the entity exists, but it's not classified as the role. So for instance, if you take the role of president, you can have that Draghi is the president of Italy, but this is not an essential property of Draghi. It's a property that is, let's say, held at a certain time in which Draghi exists, but not at all the time in which Draghi exists. Then we tried to single out the connections between the components of the organization in this other paper of 2009, in which we had, again, I won't go into the details, but the idea was to take the main components of organization from a structural point of view. So we have the roles, what we called here description, the S stands for description, that is a kind of, let's say, theory in which you talk about the connections between the roles. And you have the organization itself, which has these two components, the abstract one and the concrete one. And you have the agentive physical objects, here we called, say, the agents, like the individual who instantiates the roles. And we have described in formal terms the relation holding between all these components of the organization in this paper. Another thing we dealt with when talking about organization is the issue of group agency. And again, if you have a complex entity like an organization with an abstract part with roles and a concrete part with the players, you have to find out a way in which you can represent, you can have an entity which can act in the world. And so we represented organization in this other paper as complex roles, so roles composed by other individual roles. And our main problem was to find a way to, let's say, have a kind of strong notion of collective agency for organizations. We wanted to be able to represent how you can say that an organization is acting. And for instance, we wanted also to be able to ascribe propositional attitudes to organizations. So we wanted to account for sentences like Apple has decided to open the market in Thailand, I don't know. We wanted to understand when you can use these kind of expressions, what they mean, what do they mean when they are referred to such complex entities. And here we used, for instance, the representation of these two components that are defining group agency, again, by looking at the literature, both on collective intentionality itself, for instance, the works of List and Petit, but also another literature that is on social choice theory, on judgment aggregation. And we saw group agency as something determined by two, let's say, dimensions, the one of membership. So we wanted to be able to define when an agent could be considered as a member of an organization. And the other thing defining this, let's say, complex role is the fact that there is an aggregation procedure that allows us to say allows us to determine when an agent has to be considered, an action has to be considered an action of the organization. So, for instance, when there is a procedure like majority rule or quota rules or dictatorships or whatever you want, that is able to aggregate the individual decisions of the members, the relevant members of the organization, because again, the structure of the organization tells us what, let's say, what are the agents that have the power of deciding for the organization. Okay, I still have 5 minutes, so I will skip some of these slides. Okay, this is an interpretation is not so, I mean, it's connected to the other one. So another thing we tried to represent was the, let's say, the representation of organizational change. And here we leveraged on the theories of Kit Fine of rigid and variable embodiments. Okay, I won't go into the details of the theory of Fine, given the time constraints. But the idea is that in our approach, we started from, let's say, we saw the organization at a time like a rigid embodiment in finite terms, so a list of components taken together by a relation. And we saw the change, the organizational change, as the collection of the rigid embodiments representing the organization at a time that are picked up by this principle of variable embodiment who Kit Fine presented. This approach was very useful for us, but we found out that there was a kind of limitation for the sake of our purposes, because this principle is left, in a sense, undefined by Kit Fine. So how can we, I mean, for the organizations, it's important to understand how we can pass from from the organization at time t to the organization at time t plus 1. It's not only the passing of time that determines the fact that we are talking about the same organization. So what we used, again, was a kind of, was to refer to the decisional history of the organization So given the, let's say, the structure of the organization at time t and the power of the various roles composing the organization at time t, there are some decisions that are ascribable to the organization as a whole, and these determine what happens at t+1. So what keeps together, let's say, the rigid embodiments affine in our approach is the history of the decision taken by the relevant members of the organization. Okay. So just really a sketch on social materiality. I will go to the end, just give you the idea of what was interesting from my point of view. So as I was anticipating, in the computer science, the literature, people have started since the 80s to talk about the fact that we have to consider both the social and the technical aspects of organization. But in a sense, these two are seen as two interconnected aspects, but still separable. This new approach in sociology, which is called social materiality, that was, let's say, promoted, it was inspired by a book of 2007 by Karen Barad. This approach of social materiality, the starting point is again from quantum mechanics, and it translates the quantum mechanics idea of indeterminacy into the, let's say, the analysis of organization. So what Barad is saying is that it's not possible to really disentangle the way in which you see the organization, so let's say the epistemic aspect, from the, let's say, ontological aspect, because in a sense, once that you cut, let's say, this complex phenomena, which is in principle inseparable, the one of social material entities, one that you observe the phenomenon, you, let's say, perform a kind of agential cut that really disentangle, according to a perspective, the, let's say, the elements of the organization or the society as a whole. And this is interesting because it gives you really the idea that the interconnections between the entities is really inseparable from a, let's say, a strong point of view. But this maybe should suggest that the way in which we are modeling, so starting with the differences between the various entities, maybe is not the way to proceed to analyze such complex things like organizations in which these two dimensions are really inextricable. So maybe we should start from relations, and we should take inspiration, let's say, from other disciplines and other cultures to see under a new light a way of modeling organizations. And this is the end of the talk. Sorry for having been a bit too long. There was plenty of material.
So we will have some questions now, first, and then second, third.
You should have interrupted me earlier.
Hi, thank you for that. This is a question more to do with the basic starting off point. I think many paradoxes in philosophy, like the surprise examination, Fitch's paradox, I think many of them, involve Morean propositions which are consistent but can't be rationally held by certain people, and they end up with epistemic blind spots. So I don't know how you would guard against your system reasoning by way of Morean propositions to end up with paradoxical conclusions.
So I'm not sure I understood completely the question. So you're saying if we go with this way of reasoning, how can we address, for instance, paradoxical...
The Morean propositions, they're consistent, so from a third person point of view they can be expressed and believed, but they can't be believed or known from the subject we're talking about. So if you're trying to predict somebody's behavior, from a machine's point of view, the statement is entirely consistent. That so-and-so has this belief, but it's not consistent from, it's an epistemic blind spot for the subject themselves.
So maybe a way could be, to take into consideration the fact that, maybe you don't have a consistency at a systemic level, but in a way, what you can do, you can try to model the various perspectives, and the perspective must be consistent, ideally should be consistent in themselves. And then, okay, you should have some way to make these two perspectives that are, since the beginning, incompatible. You should find some for the machines, in formal terms, some, let's say, bridge rules to try to translate what you're saying from one point of view to the other one. Of course, I mean, if you have paradoxes, this is something that, I mean, for the machine could be a problem. But I believe that the idea behind the construction of formal ontologies is exactly this. I mean, since you cannot have, let's say, a general modeling which is valid for everyone, even though this could be consistent, what you should you should aim at is to have, let's say, different conceptualizations, but as explicit as possible in order to be able to compare them and to see where they are compatible and where they are not. Of course, it's important also to understand that something is not compatible. So I'm not sure I really...
Okay. So, thank you very much for the talk. It was extremely interesting. I have a couple of questions, actually, if I may. Very quick. Okay. So, the first one is a kind of technical philosophical one, I don't know. We know that first order logic is not categorical, of course, so we cannot describe domains, intended domains up to isomorphism. So I wanted to ask you whether is this a philosophical concern for you, and in case, what are your ideas about that, and in what sense you capture the intended model, which is a component of this of the ontology. And the second question was about the fact that you want to ascribe propositional attitudes to organizations, which is really interesting. One point is that mainly propositional attitudes are usually considered to be hyperintentional contexts. That is, in the Lightgeb-Creswell characterization of the concept, you cannot substitute logical equivalent sentences in the scope of the attitudes, salva veritate. So, is there any specific logic, internal logic of the propositional attitudes that you use in the modeling? Thank you.
Okay, this question should be not for me, actually, but for the logicians of my group. Well, what I can say is that this is not really the center of, our approach, the kind of language that we use. It's for sure, with first order logic, you cannot express, everything that you want to express. It's already a simplification. But believe me, this is already too complex when you have to deal with an automatic system. So, okay, the answer I can give you is that we try to deal with this kind of problems, having a kind of, let's say, methodology that is progressive. So usually we try to start with, let's say, the language that is as much expressive as possible. But then from this, we simplify until it's usable for the machine. But again, sometimes, you have to start, from simpler languages, because otherwise it's really difficult to then reduce the complexity.
Okay. Cool, thank you very much for that. It's really cool. I got a little confused because it's late and I'm tired. Do you treat, we all. So are you taking organizations, did they count as new individuals? Or are they just clusters of predicates? Because it felt like sometimes you were presenting them in two different ways.
No, the idea is to represent organizations as, let's say, entities in the system. But since we want to take into account all these aspects of organizations, we see them as complex roles or even complex quantities. It depends on, this is something that we are still working on.
Yeah, because what I was kind of worried about is cases where roles shift types. So it used to be a role for a person, and then it becomes like a role for an executive board or something like this. And was trying to figure out how exactly to like model that kind of thing. Do you see what I'm worried about there?
Okay, technically what we do, both with roles and with organizations, it's a kind of, let's say, trick, in the sense that we are not really interested in answering the question whether this is really an individual in the world. Yeah, so the idea is that we use this reification move to say, okay, we are aware of the fact that roles are, let's say, if you want, abstract ways of classifying properties of individuals, but we reify them and we put them into the domain. And more or less this is the same with organizations. I mean, we take into account the fact that these are formed by, it's a complex role, so formed by a composition of roles, which are played by different players at different times, but we reify this and we put it into the domain to reason about it.
Okay, so we have one last question.
Thank you very much. You have described that you are modeling relations inside the group, let's say these are normative relations which are equivalence relations. Are you also describing relations between organizations, and do you think that these are different kinds of relations?
Yes, we try to describe also relations between organizations. Yes, there are different relations in a sense that these are relations between complex entities. So, I mean, okay, there was a slide about the way in which we treat collective agency and collective intentionality, which I skipped. But let's say that when you have to do with description of, for instance, intentionality and the actions to collectives, there are many things many further problems that emerge in this description, because, for instance, there's not a simple way to, let's say, represent the collective intention as the result of the intentions of the individuals. So you need to single out the relations, the structural relations that determine how a collective intention is formed. Because, for instance, if you take an organization, it's not that all the opinions of all the members of the organization count the same. You know that there is, for instance, a board of advisors who count 10, and then the employees count 0. So, for instance. And once that you have to talk about the relations between organizations, again, this is a further layer of structuring, because if you take a complex organization like, for instance, the Organization of the United Nations, it's not that all the nations count the same, for instance. So it's a kind of, let's say, nesting process. But yes, we can represent them. It's more complex, but the idea is to be able to represent also relations between organizations. Another interesting aspect I didn't deal with, but I think it's important, is that it's important also to represent, and this is something we want to do, but we haven't done yet, how, for instance, the identity of the organization is different if seen from within the organization and from outside. So, for instance, you want a way to represent the organization to the employees because you want to empower them, for instance, and you want another way to represent the identity of the organization outside because you want to, for instance, talk about the fact that this organization that produces energy is interested in the environment. So you use different way of representing from within and from outside. So this is why I thought that the perspective, and okay, I was very quick, so maybe not very clear, but this idea of a social materiality in which the agential cuts that disentangle this complex phenomenon according to different perspectives is important for organizations, because in a sense the identity of organizations is created by the perspective in which you look at them. So the same organization can be very different seen from within and from outside.
Very good. Let's thank our speaker again. So again, we have dinner at 8. We can meet at 8:15.